Welcome to Mr. Nightbleed. Tonight, in 7 creepiest graves ever discovered across the U.S., we unearth what was never meant to see the light again. Coffins sealed with warnings, tombs built backward to confuse spirits, and graves that refuse to stay closed. These aren't legends. They're real, documented sites, each carrying its own shadow. From the cracked marble of forgotten New England cemeteries to the red clay graves of the Deep South, these burial sites tell stories that won't die. My goal this month is to reach 3,000 subscribers. Almost 90% of viewers listen and vanish without subscribing. Don't be one of them. Join the darkness. Subscribe now. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and what hour of the night it is for you. And if there's a grave or cemetery in your town that unsettles you, type its name below. Because when the world sleeps and the soil settles, some graves whisper back, kill the lights, silence the world. Take a slow breath and let us begin. The first thing I noticed was the way the old bell rope twitched without wind. A tiny tremor that set the clapper knocking once against bronze, then silence, then twice more as if someone's gloved hand had tested it and let go. I was halfway across the gate road and already wet to the cuffs from the drizzle, and that small sound felt like the cemetery clearing its throat. The sodium lamps hummed with that flat electric pitch that makes the sky look bruised, and sheets of mist were dragging through the rows. I was working the night shift for the second week in a row. My name is Daniel. I'm 37, and I took the job because I needed something quiet after my marriage cracked down the middle. Quiet isn't what cemeteries give you. They give you 1,000 tiny sounds stacked on top of each other until your head invents patterns. I was posted at the watch house just inside the iron gate, the one with the cracked window and the kettle that takes 20 minutes to pretend it is boiled. Ernie, the senior caretaker, had handed me the brass key to the chapel and said, "Save your back and don't move stones after 9. He always says save your back. He keeps peppermint tea in a dented thermos and has a habit of rolling his shoulders like a bull ready to shrug off a yoke." Lila from Records, a grad student with chipped navy nail polish, had been in earlier to check a ledger. She tapped a pencil against her lip and told me to keep an eye on the north path, because someone had relocked one of the side gates after she opened it. If it's locked again, she'd said, log it this time. The city keeps asking. She smells like paper and rain. The drizzle had turned the gravel to a dark paste that sucked at boots, and the air tasted like vinegar and metal every time I lifted my head. The smell is always here after it rains, seeping up from the old vaults and the iron fences. Not strong enough to be called stench, just the ghost of it. I checked the Motorola radio on my belt, clicked it on, listened to the static. The bell rope gave one small tug behind me. I turned and watched it settle back against the stone. My mag light bounced a cold circle across the chapel steps and the moss at the edges. The beam drifted down to the bottom landing and found nothing. And yet I swear I heard it for the first time that night. A faint humming under the steps, like a bottle singing when you run a wet finger around the rim. I make a circuit every hour. Gate road to the family mausoleums, past the old watch house with the brick chimney that hasn't drawn properly since spring. Over the narrow crest toward the columbarium and the chapel with its Yale lock that sticks unless you warm it with your palm. The map of this place is in my boots now. When I walk, I count. It's a dumb trick I picked up from a guy named Brother Dale who works daytime and coughs into his sleeve and counts everything without meaning to. Tonight I tried to let the counting drown out the humming, but when I reached the chapel again, the sound seemed to be waiting for me. I unlocked the door and clicked on the inside lights. One long fluorescent coughed awake, then a second, and the chapel took shape out of the gloom like a patience game coming together. Pews, dust, old hymnals with curled corners, and at the front, the stone steps descending under a grated door to the utility corridor that runs beneath the chapel and back toward 2 of the oldest mausoleums. We don't use the corridor much. There's a hatch halfway down that sticks. There's a rule that we don't open it without 2 people present. There's also a second rule that whoever opened the hatch last has to sign the ledger in the watch house and drop the date into the maintenance log. The page for this month had a blank where a date should have been. Lila had circled it earlier with a tiny frown. I stood at the top of those steps with rainwater slicking off my jacket, listening to what sounded like air being pulled gently through narrow pipes. Humming is the only word I have for it. Though it had a human quality without voice, a sense of being made by something that wasn't entirely mechanical. The brass key felt heavy in my pocket when I touched it. The main object of this place sits on that ring along with half a dozen smaller keys, But the brass one is what your fingers find in the dark. It opens the grate, the old records room, the side door of the watch house, and one more lock we don't talk about because the key shouldn't fit it and does. I logged the minute on my phone and did another circuit. At plot row K, a nameplate screw shivered itself loose and rattled once against the headstone. I tightened it without thinking. 20 yards down, a footprint appeared where there shouldn't have been one, crisp in the damp topsoil along the edge of an older grave that the map insisted had been backfilled last autumn. "Mislogged grave," I wrote in my head. "Ernie will love that." I tested the soil with the toe of my boot. It was damp in an unfortunate way, not soft like rain, but heavy like a sponge pressed down and released. The smell of metal was stronger there, a tang that sparked behind my teeth. By the second circuit, the side gate on the north path had been relocked again. I know I opened it. I remember the click of the latch at 9:15, the exact sound the bolt makes when it sits right. I radioed the watch house and got only a hiss and a dragging sound as if someone had set the radio down against fabric. "Ernie, you copy?" Silence. The bell rope moved, 3 slow phantom tugs. I told myself it was a draft. I told myself a lot of things that night. Lila had left a stack of copies in the chapel, plot cards, and a faded article about iron coffins. When the city was smaller, someone had been buried nearby in a cast iron coffin shaped like a human body, a style popular before the Civil War. The article was dry and clinical, but one line was underlined in faint pencil. Movement of the coffin compromised the preservation. I read it without wanting to and told myself that many things look preserved in the ground until light and air tell the truth. I folded the article, slid it beneath the ledger so it wouldn't draw my eye again, and felt the hum under the steps grow a few degrees louder. At 11, I saw lights on the hill by the perimeter and thought it was Officer Parson from the patrol, the man who smells like wet leather and greets you with a peace sign instead of a wave. I lifted the mag light and flashed twice. The lights blinked out. The radio coughed with a short burst and died. A train in the distance let out one long horn that I pretended drowned the hum because pretending helps. I warmed my hands over the space heater and stared at the brass key laying on the blotter like a coin someone had left as a tip. The second half of nights like this are always worse. There's a tilt to them. After midnight, even the drizzle seems to think you shouldn't be here, and the lamps take on that sodium slant that flattens faces and makes the stones look damp even when they're not. I took the Fisker's pruners from the peg and clipped a vine that had reached toward the name M. Ruiz, and hissed when I cut it, a sound my head turned into speech. Ms. Ruiz's granddaughter, Maria, had brought carnations 2 days ago and told me she could smell her grandmother's cologne when she touched the stone. I didn't want to smell anything that night. The vinegar metal taste crept back each time I slowed. At the 40% mark, if I were breaking my life into fractions, the humming under the chapel steps let me know it wasn't an accident of water and pipes. I found myself standing again at the grate, the brass key warming in my palm. I listened and heard the sound pulse at the edge of hearing, the way a refrigerator hum becomes obvious only when it stops. I touched the grate and felt a faint vibration, not enough to rattle the lock, but definitely there. The Yale yielded the way it always does when you press on the faceplate and turn left. The grate lifted enough to let out a cold breath. I stood with it in my hands and thought, "Don't be stupid." I lowered it until it rested on the frame and stepped back, locked it again, and wrote down, "Second thoughts are the best thoughts, Daniel," in my head with a voice that sounded like my ex because memory likes its little jokes. The anomalies stacked themselves like paper. The bell rope tremored at intervals that made pattern from coincidence. The north gate latch clicked from closed to open when I turned my back and then back to closed. When I checked row K again, the damp patch had widened without rain. When I took a photograph of the mislogged grave to attach later, the screen caught a faint mist hanging low to the ground that didn't show up when I looked with my own eyes. I heard what I would have sworn was a faint hum not only under the steps but now under the gravel, a felt tone that ran up my legs when I stood still. Around 1:30, Ernie finally came on the radio with a crackle and a sleepy, "You breathing?" He was at home, voice wrapped in blankets. He told me to check the utility corridor for a leak because the transformer had tripped twice earlier. I didn't tell him about the humming. He would come down in his boots in the drizzle to show me there's nothing there and tell me to save my back. I said I'd check and call if the breaker looked wrong. He told me not to be a hero and clicked off. I took the brass key, the mag light, and the radio, and I opened the grate. The steps are short and steep and smell like old pennies. My breath made a small white shape in the air. The sodium light through the main windows didn't reach here, and the fluorescent in the entry flickered once and steadied, painting everything in a low, patient blue. The hum increased by an amount that made my scalp feel tight. It wasn't loud, but it took up space. It felt like standing near a hive without seeing bees. The corridor runs under the chapel and then forks. One leg toward the records closet, one toward the oldest mausoleums. The hum came from the right. I told myself leak and kept moving. The padlock on the hatch halfway down had been left on the hasp but not closed, a kind of lazy surface obedience that said someone had meant to lock it and been interrupted. The hasp was new steel on old wood. I lifted it with my thumb and the hatch gave a sigh and rose an inch as if someone had pressed from underneath. I froze with my maglite beam steady on the seam. No air moved. Nothing emerged. The hum multiplied itself for a second like two notes had been struck an octave apart, and then settled back into one. My mouth had dried with that chalky fear that makes swallowing feel like work. The choice is always like this. The cemetery forces you into small, honest decisions. Do you open a door you don't want to because that is your job? Or do you lie to your job because you are a creature with a heartbeat? I knelt and slid the hatch back. The brass key warmed my fingers again, doing nothing and yet somehow present as if it were meant for this lock too. The space beneath the hatch was a narrow pit lined in stone, then earth, then stone again. A short ladder dropped into it, rung slick with condensation. The hum was stronger here, not especially loud but dense, as if it had body. A trickle of water ran along the right-hand side and disappeared under the stone. The maglite found a smear on the far wall that read like handwriting and wasn't. I told myself it was mineral bleed. I told myself not to read it. The radio on my belt hissed and clicked like someone had brushed the mic. The voice that came through was Lila's, quiet and too near. "Don't move it," she said, and then static. I answered and heard my own breath come back at me a second later, as if the radio had bitten its own tail. I thought of the article under the ledger, the line about movement and preservation failing, and my head did something unhelpful with that sentence, turning the corridor into a throat and the hum into a swallowed sound that didn't want out. I climbed down. The rungs groaned but held. The air had that vinegar metal taste in a sharper form now, a sting in the nose. The beam of the maglite shook enough to show my hand had started to tremble. At the bottom, the pit opened into a narrow crawl space that ran beneath the mausoleum steps. By the scant light, I saw a stack of crates half-rotted and a narrow slab against the far wall that didn't belong. The slab had iron studs along the edge in the shape of a body. The faint outline of a face sharpened by the angle of the beam into an optical illusion that wasn't completely illusion. The iron had bloomed rust where fingers would be. 5 small flowers of it. I didn't touch it. I stood with my shoulder blades against cool stone and listened to the hum gather at the corners. There was no door to shut my eyes and pretend distance with. The hum rose half a tone and the water made a delicate tapping sound like a spoon against a glass, and somewhere above me someone tugged the bell rope 3 times, slow and courteous. I told myself that if I turned and climbed and shut the hatch without closing the padlock, I would feel this space like a mouth open behind me for the rest of my life. I told myself that if I stayed, I would make the kind of sense out of noise that ends careers. I said out loud to the empty place, "I'm not moving anything." It felt like answering a question I hadn't asked and one that had been asked of me since before I opened the grate. The humming eased a fraction. It wasn't a dramatized easing. It was the kind of change you'd miss if you weren't braced for it. I turned carefully, set the maglite on the rung so the beam angled down, and reached up for the hatch. The brass key was in my mouth for a second, taste of metal bitter as blood. I slid the hatch with 2 fingers and it came surprisingly easy, as if someone had nudged from the other side. I hauled myself up, left elbow scraping the edge, and stood in the corridor with knees damp and palms black. I shut the hatch and laid the padlock in place and did not click it. I don't know why I didn't click it. Maybe because I wanted the corridor to decide for itself what should be open and what shouldn't, and I didn't want my name in a ledger tied to any of it. When I reached the chapel threshold, the fluorescent light flickered its stuttery Morse and died. The sodium lamps outside threw that dull orange wash through the stained glass and painted me a stranger's face on the glossy floor. I heard footsteps on the gate road and thought relief and called out. Officer Parsons' silhouette filled the doorway with his leather jacket dark as oil. He lifted a hand in the peace sign and took 2 steps in and stopped, head cocked like a dog hearing a far whistle. "You hear that?" he asked. I told him it was a leak. He said leaks don't keep time, and stood still long enough that we both felt the hum as a pulse in the soles of our feet. I called Ernie anyway. He listened and let me talk myself into and out of several decisions. He said, "If you didn't move anything, go home in your head and finish your shift with your body. Save your back. The morning crew will look." I made 3 more circuits because ritual keeps the mind from crowning with panic. On the first, the mislogged grave had settled like a cake that realizes it's out of eggs. The dampness contracted into a smoother oval, the smell less bright. On the second, the north gate stood slightly ajar, as if a hand had left it so that someone could pass without a clang. On the third, the bell rope hung still and the taste of metal had retreated. The radio stayed quiet, except for the delicate scratching of someone breathing. At the far end of the line, and realizing that they had leaned too close to the mic, I wrote my notes in the ledger when the drizzle backed off and the sky lightened from purple to a gray, the color of pencil shavings. I wrote that I had not opened the hatch and then crossed it out, and wrote that I had, and then crossed out the crossing out. Lila showed up at 5 with a stack of cards and a pencil behind her ear. She read my notes and lifted an eyebrow. She tapped the page and said, "The city loves clarity." Her nail clicked against the word hum like it was a bead on a string. She didn't ask about the iron coffin article. I didn't bring it up. We stood in the chapel and listened to nothing, and found it more comforting than we should have. At dawn, I walked to the gate to swing it open and saw that the padlock on the north path had been threaded through the latch and left unclicked. I clicked it, then clicked it again because habit can be a kind of prayer. The air had rinsed itself clean for now, and the sodium lamps clicked off in a slow chain like someone was extinguishing candles one by one. Ernie came up the road with steam coming out of his thermos and said, "Well?" As if the word were a netcast for all I wouldn't say. I told him I'd make coffee, and he said peppermint tea is coffee for people who don't like coffee, and grinned. We checked the corridor together. The grate opened with the same soft sigh and revealed steps that looked like steps. The hatch lay shut with the padlock resting like a coin where I'd left it. The hum, if it existed, hid itself among the basement noises and the whisper of our jackets. Ernie put a hand to the stone and raised his eyebrows the way he does when a thing matches his expectation and confounds it at the same time. "If it's a leak," he said, "it will show itself when the ground warms." He put the padlock through the hasp and clicked it. The sound was smaller than I expected and more final. I worked the day into a normal shape. I wrote that the mislogged grave requires review. I walked the rows and nodded to names that have become familiar. Mr. Gupta, who comes at noon and smells like cloves even in the rain, waved from his wife's plot and said, "Quiet night?" I told him yes. It wasn't a lie in the way that matters. The sky broke open to a pale band and the chapel windows gave back a softer light. The bell hung passive and dull. The brass key sat warm on my palm when I closed the watch house for a moment to breathe. When my shift ended, I signed out. Lila handed me a photocopy of my own messy log and said, "The city loves handwriting." Her smile was the kind you give someone who has stared too long at one thing. I stepped out into a morning that smelled like wet grass instead of iron. At the gate, the bell rope stirred once as if an insect had flown too close and brushed it with a wing. I turned and looked down the path toward the chapel. There was no one there. Nothing moved. The sodium lamps were dead and quiet. The drizzle had stopped. The cemetery held its breath in that way it has, suspended between stories. Driving home later, I could still feel the hum, the way you can still feel a boat under your feet when you've come ashore. It wasn't loud. It was a suggestion under the day, under the thin clatter of my keys and the sigh of my chair and the kettle pretending again. When I closed my eyes, I saw the brass studs set in iron like finger bones under a curtain. I heard 3 slow tugs on a rope that might as well have been a pulse. I told myself air and water and old stones will sing when you press your ear to them long enough. I told myself I am not here to move anything. In the quiet of my kitchen, with the window fogging and the world behaving normally, I realized the room had settled around a frequency I recognized. Beneath the cupboard door, beneath the floorboards, just at the edge of hearing, there it was again, faint and patient, as if it had followed me home and lay beneath my steps, humming under the nearest set of stairs. The first thing I remember is the sound of something settling under the earth. A dry shift like a bag of rice poured slow in the dark. A nameplate on a high family crypt ticked on its screw, and the sound dragged all the way across the lane under the dripping sodium lamp. In the chapel, the old brass bell rope twitched once and went still, but the bell didn't ring. I stood in the drizzle with my mag light off because the light made the fog glare white. The drizzle smelled cold and dusty, like wet concrete and old coins. I'm 34 and I work nights for the Cook County Preservation Initiative as a security aide at Greenwood Annex No. 2, which is the polite name for a ribbon of peripheral burial grounds stitched along a rail line in a storm ditch. I'm not a guard with a gun. I have a Yale ring of keys, a Motorola that squawks when I lean wrong, and a laminated map that never lines up with the ground once you're out there under the lamps. I took the job after my father died. He used to say cemeteries are the only places in a city where you can hear your own shoes. He wasn't entirely right about that. Sometimes you hear other things. The reason I was there that night with Marta and Buck was that a volunteer team had opened a sealed mausoleum on the annex's north perimeter, a low limestone structure half sunk into the berm by the storm ditch. Someone had reported vandalism, but the lock didn't look forced. The preservation office wanted the interior logged and the door rekeyed, which meant I would hold the ring and write numbers while they did their work. Simple, Buck said when he signed the tool sheet with a broad, nail-streaked hand. He ran a steel blower in the fall and mowed in summer, known for chewing sunflower seeds and for saying easy money like a prayer. Marta, our project lead, kept her hair wound tight under a knit cap and had a habit of tapping the end of her pen against her teeth while she read. She never used words like haunted. She said anomalous activity and contingency plan and meant them. We met at the gate road as the drizzle settled from a mist to a slow fall, the kind that makes your hood drum. Sodium lamps buzzed and drew halos on the wet pavement. 2 background faces passed us when I started the shift. Mr. Kinsley, a widower who walked the fence at night, peppermint on his breath, and a woman named Aaliyah, who left orchids for her sister and snapped her gum like she was marking time. I logged them out as the office closed. Reverend Cole from the little chapel shook my hand with paper-dry fingers and told me he was locking up early. Bad weather, bad nights, he said to no one in particular and walked off with his collar up. The walk to the north perimeter took us past the older section where the names on the stones tilt like they're listening, then down a lane that turned to broken pavement and finally to gravel. The storm ditch gurgled slow. I remember that first faint humming as we came to the mausoleum steps, low and even, more like a resonance than a tune. It could have been wind under the stone, I told myself. It could have been the ditch or the lamps or the city carrying a thin line of sound out here to die on the steps. But I felt it in my teeth like the echo you get when you blow across a bottle mouth, and it made the drizzle taste slightly metallic. Do you hear that? I asked. Hear what? Buck said and spat a sunflower hull into the ditch. Marta didn't answer. She had the folder open and was flipping, pen tapping gently against her front tooth. Annex 2 Perimeter Mausoleum, internal designation K14, she said. Purchase date 1911. Occupant registry blank. There's a note about a glass coffin in a 1978 memo from the Historical Society. But that's probably apocryphal because who would transport glass through freeze-thaw? We log, we photograph, we seal. Easy money. She said the last 2 words like she was making fun of Buck, and Buck grinned. I tried the Yale ER2 key on the brass cylinder and it didn't turn. I tried a K14 tag and it bound halfway and gritted like there was sand in it. Procedural anomaly 1, I thought, and wrote it down because I feel better when I write things in the ledger. Like each line pins something to the page that might otherwise walk around. Marta kept tapping her pen, then put her glove over the end so she wouldn't chip a tooth and said to try the older brass key with the smooth head, the one someone had sawed short years ago to fit the old barrels. It turned. We swung the door open on a breath of air that smelled like damp stone and something sharp, something vinegar metal that cut through the drizzle. The first impression was blue darkness like lake water. Then my eyes found angles and sheen. The coffin was glass. The woman inside wore a white dress that had gone not yellow but a kind of moon gray with dust. Her hands were folded over a bouquet that had collapsed to sticks and a powder that used to be flowers. At the head, just over her shoulder, the brass plaque read, "Till he returns." There was no name. The condensation had licked little arcs across the inside like snails had traced their windows. My mag light clicked on and made a white bar across her face that lit a fine line of stitches where her veil was basted to a comb. I moved the beam away because shining light on a sleeping face feels like waking a child. People didn't do this, Buck said. Glass breaks. She'd freeze. Marta slid past him, breath small in the cold. It's a commercial plate glass at least an inch thick. They did sometimes use it. Chicago had a few. The detail here is the brass rails, and the fact that it's not stolen. Who is she? I asked. On the stone ledge under the plaque sat a ledger page mounted behind a pane. It was not frozen to the backing like some we see. You could see where the ink had feathered in damp and dried. It read, "Purchase, 1 tempered glass casket, 1 key with duplicate, 1 inscription plate till he returns." No date of interment, no officiant. Between the lines, a brown water bloom had spread like a crushed flower. There was nothing else. Marta took her photos. Buck moved the beam of his headlamp in an impatient pattern. I stood by the steps and listened to the hum. I thought it was louder, then softer, then gone. But when Buck set his camera case down and it ticked against the limestone, the hum seemed to swallow the small sound and make it rounder. I thought about the ditch. I thought about the lamps. I wrote in the ledger, faint vibration, hum under stairs. Check rail alignment, rebar. When we closed the door, the air temperature jumped a hair and the drizzle darkened the stone around the keyhole like it had tears. We started to lock up, but the key wouldn't come out. The GR4 tag had turned and seated. The barrel had engaged, but the key sat stubbornly like a jaw clamped on a spoon. Anomaly 2. I breathed and was about to work it gently when the Motorola on my chest barked with a squeal, and the captain's voice cut in and out. "Got a north, Marta, do you copy?" "Copy," Marta said, her voice flattened. "We're at K14 securing." "Got a family at the gate," he said. Confused. Asking about a visitation. Name matches nothing. D'Amico's going to walk them out in the rain and show them the sign that says Annex closed. He says they keep asking about the bride. He says someone told them it was open tonight. I looked up at that. The drizzle was steady. No one was near us. We were a long walk from any gate. "Do they have names?" I asked into the radio. "Guy asked me to tell you his name is James," D'Amico said, and his rain jacket squeaked like he was moving. He was real specific about that. Names always make it feel like the room narrows. We just logged a James who left a candle in the columbarium for his brother. Different section, though. I made myself write it down with a note to follow up. Marta was at the door, her face turned sideways to the keyhole, listening. "It's breathing," she said, and I hated that she said it not like a joke but like an observation. "Stone breathes," Buck said, but he shivered. "Let's go. Relock it in the dry." "Dry?" Marta asked and smiled without looking at him. We left it closed while I went to the cart for the supply box, which meant walking back up the lane and passing the chapel. The bell rope in there hung still behind the clear glass. I had the sense of being watched from the dark windows where you can see your own reflection, with the night pressed in behind it like an old movie overlay. I opened the supply box for the weatherproof pad to cover the lock, and saw that the box was not the one I had checked out. The tape seal had my initials from last week and today's ink over them, but inside were Fiskar shears, not the standard lock cover we use for rainwork. Anomaly 3. I swallowed and put the shears down gently and picked up the lock cover that shouldn't have been there. When I turned, I saw a wet footprint on the concrete by the chapel door where there was no roofline drip. I am not a person who sees ghosts. I'm a person who writes down model numbers and notices when a key turns not quite right. I am also a person who loses track of time when I'm working. My phone said it was 12:41, but when I looked up at the sodium lamp clock across the lane by the day office, its face was fogged, and the minute hand stayed at 10. The air tasted like cold pennies. I heard something that was almost a melody, then almost the ditch. The hum under the steps rose a notch, not volume but pressure. The escalating small things kept happening. Anomaly 4 was a relocked side gate we had left open, so we could bring the cart through the perimeter path. Anomaly 5 was a mislogged grave on the laminated map. Plot G23 printed where there was a lane. Anomaly 6 was the lantern wick in the caretaker shed refusing to take flame, though it had burned last week. Buck grumbled and shook it like that would change fuel. His headlamp flickered and went bright again. Marta's pen stopped tapping, and the silence after the tapping was like taking your watch off and suddenly noticing your pulse. All three of us started to match our breathing to the hum without meaning to. And then we caught ourselves and broke the rhythm like you do when you realize you're walking in step with someone you don't know. Buck was the first to say something honest. "I don't like this," he said. "That thing with the key. The smell. And I don't like that inscription." "Till he returns," I said. "To who?" he asked. We went back to the mouth of the mausoleum with the pad ready. I crouched to the lock, and because I was nervous, I put the radio down for a second on the stone ledge where the ledger page sat. I had the sense of someone standing right behind me and started to talk because talking keeps you from hearing things inside your head. "We're securing K-14 exterior pad over old barrel until new core is issued," I said. My voice sounded calm. My hands felt like I had washed them in cold alcohol. That was when the bell in the chapel rang once, very soft, like someone tugged the rope just enough to kiss the brass with the clapper. We all froze. The chapel was 2 lanes away, empty. The hum under the steps didn't change, didn't pause or answer, but it felt nearer. The way a train you can't see feels nearer when the ground begins to talk. Marta made a decision with her jaw. "Open it," she said. We look again. We confirm inventory. We close in pad. Then we go write our anomalies up in a room with a door. "What inventory?" Buck asked, but his hands were already on the door. "The duplicate key," she said. "Ledger says 2. We need to confirm the second is present." I turned the Yale with my glove off so I could feel when the pins yielded. The lock accepted me like I knew it. When the door opened, the glass box breathed a fog bloom on its own interior and then cleared. I stepped sideways because I didn't want to stand directly in front of her face. Marta swept the light along the ledge. There, in a little trough cut in the stone beneath the plaque, sat a second brass key, identical to the one in my hand except for a notch filed strange. It was wet as if someone had just taken it out of their mouth. "Got it," she said. "Photograph log." And then her pen tapped once against her teeth and she flinched and set it down and pressed the back of her hand to her lips like they had burned. "Don't touch it," I said. But she had already picked it up for the photo, and the metal made an audible, small, wet sound against her glove. We all heard it and thought of tongues. The next minutes are knotted tight in my head. The radio skittered on the stone and I reached before it could fall. Something moved in the glass coffin. Not a lot, not a dramatic shift. The bouquet's powder slid minute grains onto the glass in a way that could have been vibration from the steps, or from the way Buck had set his weight differently, but we all saw it and our bodies answered like we had seen a face blink. The inscription plate had a tiny screw that caught my maglite beam and made a restless little star. Up the lane, the squeak of a rain jacket came and went. It could have been D'Amico walking a perimeter. It could have been the sound lamp transformed into something like footsteps by the funhouse acoustics of wet stone and fences. When the hum under the steps deepened, my teeth sang again and my eyes watered. I said a sharp, stupid thing like, "We're not alone out here." And Marta nodded once without looking at me. We were at the point where you have to decide whether to do the reasonable thing or the thing that feels smart. Reasonable was close and pad and go. Smart, for me then, felt like making sure that what I was leaving behind wouldn't be already open when I walked away. Fear has a way of making you thorough. We took one more inventory sweep. That was when Buck's headlamp went to a dull pulse and my maglite stuttered like cheap theater lightning. The sodium lamp behind us buzzed higher, then guttered, then came on. Something hummed like breath, but not inside a chest. It came from the stone under our feet. The steps had a faint radial pattern, a sunburst cut shallow by a mason for traction. The vibration made the water in the grooves tremble. Marta reached and pressed her palm against the step like she could feel a heartbeat in her throat. "It's not the ditch," she said. We fell into a pattern of working that felt like a drill. Buck held the door with his shoulder because it wanted to swing in. Marta wrapped the duplicate key in a dry rag and put it in a zip bag. I took note numbers with a glove squeak on wet plastic. My throat hurt. Maybe from breathing through my mouth, maybe from the smell that was now definitely vinegar metal and not rain. The culminating moment came as a choice I can write down with brand names and numbers, so you know exactly how stupid or brave we were. The glass coffin had a small brass latch at the foot. Ornamental or practical, I don't know. It was the sort of thing a funeral director could click and feel a measure of control. It was also a thing that, if it were not supposed to be unlatched, would offend the dead, and possibly anyone who cared about them. But there was moisture inside the glass that did not match the air outside, and the bouquet's powder had moved and the hum did not stop. The reasonable thing was to leave it. The smart or brave thing felt like cracking the lid and breaking whatever pressure stood between then and now. You will think I wanted to see her face or touch her sleeve. I did not. I wanted to stop hearing that sound. Marta looked at me and then at Buck and then at the latch, and her hand was steady when she said, "On my count. 1. We did it. The sound inside the crypt changed at once, like putting a spoon into simmering water. The hum turned whispery and then stopped for 2 beats so clean I felt the sky lean. The latch lifted without fuss. The glass lid had a rubberized seam that broke with a quiet lipless kiss. Cold air came out and tasted like old metal and lilies. Somewhere behind us the bell rang once, soft. Too soft to travel that far realistically, but there it was in our bones. The bouquet slumped more. The veil trembled as if someone sighed under it, or as if the air sighed in. Her skin was not gone. It was not the color of anything alive, but it was there. The fine pores like tiny moon craters. Something like condensation, a line as delicate as a snail trail, moved on the inside of the glass near her temple and drew a swoop that could have been the edge of a letter. The inscription plate below us looked different in the sudden, not quite stillness. The letters were the same. The brass was not. Under the right-hand screw, the metal had worn bright in a little circle like a thumb had worried it lovingly for years. "Enough," Buck said. "We're done." He had never said that word that way before. He meant not that the task was complete, but that we would survive if we made it true. We closed it. The lid set. The latch clicked. The hum came back, softer, lower. Not in the bones, but like a countertop vibrating when someone walks heavy. The 3 of us worked fast in the drizzle. Pad went on. Barrel locked. I hesitated over the key. The duplicate in the bag looked too much like a tongue preserved. I put it in the inventory envelope and tucked it in my jacket like it was both contraband and medicine. The next part of the night is full of procedural detail. We wrote our notes. We locked the chapel and logged the bell rope position. D'Amico never reached us. He'd had a call at the main gate and turned back. The family asking about a visitation had left behind a wet palm print on the office glass. Too thin to be a man's. The minute hand on the sodium clock jumped from 10 to 42 while we watched it. At one point, somewhere around 3, the side gate was latched, though none of us had touched it. I checked the latch for dirt and found none in the fresh wet. A name on the laminated map, which I had traced with the dull pencil because the ink runs in drizzle, repeated where it shouldn't. Jam, printed faint between plots like a palimpsest. I wrote that down and then erased it, and then the ghost of the letter stayed. Tonight I can think of grad school words for that. In the moment, it felt like the paper had learned a name and couldn't stop saying it. We made it through to the part of night when the lamps turn from sodium to that pre-dawn gray that removes shadows without making light. The drizzle eased to a mist and then to a suspended glitter that made the air look like a snow globe someone shook once and set down. Marta was sitting on the steps writing her final line, the bagged key on her knee like a little fish, when she stopped tapping the pen and just listened. "Do you still hear it?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "No," Buck said, and then, "Yes, but different." It was different. It was in my mouth, not my teeth, like tasting a battery. The main gates rusted with a heavy sound, and I knew that the grounds truck would be here soon, and the sprinklers would sputter on, and the day crew would laugh in that way that day crews laugh at night crews because they think night makes us nervous. The hum folded down, softer and softer, until it left the frequency where we felt it and entered the one where it only remembered itself. For 5 minutes we didn't talk. Then we did the last ridiculous argument that has to happen because it lets you leave. It was about whether to bring the duplicate key to the office safe or leave it in the chapel box. We decided to bring it. On our way across the gravel, the bell rang twice, very soft, as if hands thought better of a third. I felt the hair on my neck stand up and then lie down again as if there had been a brief wind. I can't explain the family that never appeared on camera, the wet palm on the glass, the minute hand that lagged and then jumped. I can explain the vinegar metal smell as the off-gassing of old fittings and damp. I can tell you the hum might be the ditch or the rail or a highway far off. I can tell you that glass coffins exist, rare and impractical and beautiful in the way that impractical things preserved by luck are beautiful. I can tell you we did not put our hands inside, that we did not disturb anything we weren't already disturbing by being people, night-soaked and curious. The last anomaly came as we were leaving, and I only noticed because I am a person who looks at screws. The tiny screw at the right corner of the inscription plate sat half a thread higher than when we came, the bright wear around it a little larger, as if a thumb had loved it once while waiting. I told myself the temperature had moved the metal, The way lids loosen when a jar cools. I told myself a lot of reasonable things. We turned toward the gate road, and the gray light made the gravel look like bone chips in the lane. At dawn, the captain took the bagged key between two fingers like a bug he would not crush and dropped it into the safe. He joked that if a man named James came asking, we should ask which one. We laughed and pretended it was normal when Buck said easy money in a voice like someone learning a language again. The day crew fired up the steel and the droning sound drowned almost everything else. Almost. I went back once, 2 weeks later, alone in daylight. The hum was not there then, or not for me. The inscription had tarnished around the letters as if breath had collected and dried. The screw gleamed its small sun. When I closed my eyes at the top of the steps, I could not hear anything but traffic and crows. I thought that whatever we had heard might be gone as night things are. I was wrong. Sometimes now, when a drizzle beads on the chain link at the perimeter and the bell rope hangs perfectly still in its window and my mag light is off because the fog makes the beam a wall, I stop at those steps and I stand very quiet. Far under the stone comes a line of sound, steady and patient as a man walking home. A faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps that I tell myself I am not hearing. If the wind is right, I can taste metal. If the morning is near, it can be quiet enough to count. 1, 2, and then, after a pause that feels like someone reading a plaque with their thumb on the screw, a third softer, as if the earth is practicing the sound of a return. The first sound was a rattle, the tiny metallic chatter of a nameplate working itself loose on a vault as if the drizzle had fingers. Then the rain guttered in the oaks and the whole cemetery exhaled, a soft settling of stone and wet air. I stopped on the gate road with my maglight pointed low and heard something under it all that wasn't wind, a thin tone that seemed to come up through the steps of the big Arsenault mausoleum. By the time I swung the beam toward the stairs, the tone was gone, replaced by the hiss of cold rain on limestone. I'm a 34-year-old night watch for Lafayette Cemetery No. 1, hired through the city's preservation contractor, because people keep slipping in after hours and because the weather has been wrong. Tonight I was in because a storm band had stalled over the garden district, a gray curtain that made the sodium lamps go fuzzy and orange. Marcel, the daytime caretaker, had pressed the heavy ring of brass keys into my hand at shift change and said, "You good, Cher? Watch the drains." He tugged his earlobe like he does when he's worried and told the old story again without smiling. The singing casket, the musician, the harmonica that learned the wind. I laughed then because I always do, and because the watch house had the dry smell of paper and coffee and everything seemed manageable. By the 5th minute outside, I realized the lock on the Washington Avenue gate was engaged from the wrong side. I had logged it open for the trolley of the masonry crew earlier. The entry in the ledger had my initials. Now the Yale was snapped shut from the street side. Orange rain light ran down the bars. Inside the watch house, the ledger page where I'd written the open time had a damp ripple to it that hadn't been there an hour ago. The page wasn't blanked or torn. The ink just looked absorbed, bruised into the paper. Small things like that add up on a wet night. You try to ignore them. You tell yourself the last guy made a mistake. The cemetery draws sound in and holds it. Tires hiss on the far side of the wall. But inside the gates, all you hear are drops on leaves, trickles in the low drains. The small adjustment sounds of brick and plate. I made my rounds with my Motorola clipped to my jacket and the mag light in my left hand. The beam bounced off the marble into wide, pale strips. On square 3, a floral cone had fallen and rolled against a slab. The flowers were fake but already bleeding red dye into the water, a crescent on stone like a mouth. Miss Inez Carré's lilies were still upright by her family vault, wired so tight they stayed proud in the drizzle. I only know her cough candy smell because she comes every Friday with a napkin of beignets for Marcel and mothballs in her sweater. A cigar butt lay wet by the Gramillion wall. I thought of Mr. Landry, and the way the rain always glosses his hat and flattens his cigar into a dark comma. He hadn't been through today, but his habits stick to the place. The first anomaly after the gate was a mislogged interment. On the plot map, Arsenault was square 2, alley A, vault 17. On the brass plate, it was spelled Arsenault, but the number was 13, and someone had penciled a faint 17 over the 13 like a correction nobody finished. The pencil mark was soft and recent, not the kind of century-old graphite that lives on old maps. I flipped the ring of keys in my palm and felt for the shallow nick on the Arsenault key. Marcel showed me that once, Said it's how you find it when the dark is a hurry. I wasn't opening anything. I was just verifying numbers, the little procedural patience that keeps a place like this honest. The rain at the Arsenault steps tasted like copper. I say that because when the drops hit my lips, they had that faint vinegar metal tang you only notice in certain storms. I stood with one boot on the first riser listening. Somewhere under the stone, so faint I had to hold my breath to find it, came that thread of sound again. Not a whistle, not a motor. A human note without a human breath. It vibrated through the sole of my boot the way a stereo bass will ride a wood floor. By the time I leaned down and touched the cold edge of the second step, the note was gone again. The air under there felt colder, as if a draft was pulling through a gap not big enough to see. On the Motorola, Tasha did the scheduled check-in from the preservation office, voice clipped and even. "Document not disturbed," she said, like she always did before signing off. And I answered that the drains were fine. She works one finger into her pencil behind her ear when she talks. I could hear that motion in the way her words sometimes came with a soft click of graphite on clip. It was a comfort to hear her at first. The second check-in came with a wash of white noise that made a chord. I moved the radio away from my coat and the noise fell back into static. When I set the radio on the Arsenault steps to adjust my jacket, the static tightened into something like a breathy chord again. The moment I picked it up, the sound frayed and died. I didn't tell Tasha that. She would have said the word interference 3 times and told me to keep the radio off the stone. The watch house lantern refused to cooperate when I went back for it. Vintage thing we keep for power issues. A Dietz with a stubborn wick Marcel babies like a pet. I filled the reservoir, trimmed the black off the end of the wick with my fiskars and lit it. The flame sank, flared, and then drowned itself with a soft gulp. On the second attempt, the lamp bloomed steady, then wavered and made a low ringing as if the glass itself had become a bell. I set it down and it cut out. I imagined Marcel in the morning clucking at me, crooking his finger like a conductor as he adjusted the thin strip of wick. I took my mag light instead, feeling stupid about the charm of old tools when I was alone in a wet city of stone. The rising weirdness was slow and mostly paperwork. A sheet I'd tucked under a paperweight had worked itself free and drifted across the desk like it wanted the floor. The heavy brass nameplate from the Giori tomb clicked twice and then stayed. The steel we keep in the caretaker shed for after-storm blowdowns coughed once without the key in it, a pressure burp of fuel that carried a sweet plastic smell. And there were shoe prints that got me thinking about someone cutting through. They were half prints, edges feathered by rain, here and gone along the perimeter. I called out like I do, my voice loud under the oaks, telling whoever might be in there that the place was closed and that the police passed by every 30 minutes. The only answer was the soft tapping of water off the cypress, the far hiss of tires, and once, distantly, what I swear was a harmonica note riding the wind like a thin thread. Again from those Arsenault steps. At 40% of the night, call it just before midnight, the humming under the Arsenault stairs came and stayed. I wouldn't have noticed it if the sodium lights hadn't flickered. The storm did that thing where the city goes briefly dim and then the whole place brightens again as if somebody cleaned the air. In that shift, the tone felt anchored to the steps, not to the wind or to me. I put my hand flat on the second riser and felt the sound in my palm bones. The note didn't move around. It was a continuous pitch, the kind you can hum with and feel silly doing it. I tried it lightly, a kind of question back to a noise. The vibration in the stone drifted a hair, then steadied again like it had found me and decided I didn't matter. My radio gave a small huff. I didn't notice until later that the heavy brass key to Arsenault had shifted on the ring during all my fumbling, and now lay on top, pointed toward the stairs. If you work nights long enough, you collect background people in your head. Benny Gauthier, the mason with lime in the beds of his nails and a low whistle when he lifts. Kiki, who sells tour tickets by day and sneaks in after hours to light a candle. Gardenia heavy perfume hanging in the gate road for an hour after she's left. Officer Duarte, who stops at the iron bars, leather jacket gone dark with rain, and taps his knuckle on the gate in a slow 2-beat like a drummer counting himself into a quiet song. I thought about them just then for reasons I couldn't explain, maybe trying to summon daylight habits to push back the strangeness. Kiki's humming is always a pop melody under her breath. Benny's whistle is practical. Neither sounded like the thread under the steps. Close to one, my own name jumped me. I was checking plates in square one when I saw Daniels in raised letters on a vault I knew didn't carry that name yesterday. It was Dandridge last week. You could explain a painted name with fresh grief, but cast letters don't change. The next sweep, it was back to Dandridge. I chalked that moment to angle and water and my brain filling gaps. Still, I dragged my fingers over the letters. They were cold and steady and absolutely what they were. The rain light made my eyes lie. The ledger book came out again because that's what I can control. I flipped to 1903 like a person checking a superstition and found the entry Marcel always points to when he tells the story. Émile Arsenault, musician by trade. Interred with personal effects. The phrase is neat script, the ink brown but not broken. Marcel says the mourners kept asking for the grave to be reopened during the first big storm after. The workmen refused. Wind carries foolishness, he says, and then his eyes go to the steps as if the stone is listening. I felt for the key again. I told myself I wasn't going to need it. At 2, the wind shifted and pushed rain into the oaks at a slant that made the lamps look smeared. I did the thing you do when you don't want to feel foolish and put the radio on the Arsenault stair again. The static braided into a near melody that matched the pitch of the stone hum, and then seemed to comb through higher harmonics like a hand across strings. The sound made the hair on my forearm stand. It wasn't loud. It was intimate, the way a person's breath is when they lean close enough to fog your glasses and you pretend not to notice. I picked the radio up and the harmonics cut off, but the low note kept. I pressed my palm to the step and felt the rhythm of the water in the drain below, and something like a second pulse out of time with it. I tried not to use the word heartbeat. Climax began in a way I couldn't dress up. The drain clogged. Water pooled in the depression by the step and ran back toward the gate road. If the flow doesn't draw off, it creeps into the family vaults by capillary without asking permission. Marcel's voice lives under my own in those moments. Watch the drains. He worries about freeze-thaw cycles, but water does its worst before it ever freezes. It was a forced choice, practical more than spooky. Either I open the Arsenault gate and check the drain intake behind the stairs to keep water from undermining the foundation, or I let the humming go on and the water rise and hope I can explain the decision later to a man who has spent 40 years keeping mortar intact. The Yale lock on the gate sat pretty in the rain with a thin lace of orange dripping from its toe. My hand shook more than I wanted it to as I sorted the keys. The Arsenault key was not complicated. It was just a key, old brass, with a shallow notch near the head where someone had dropped it 100 times. The lock took it like it had been hungry. I swung the gate open just enough to lean in one shoulder, and the cold inside that space was surprising. There is a particular chill that comes off marble, and muscle memory tells you to whisper in it. My mag light caught the lips of the stairs and the little crawl space under them where the drain begins. The slot was crowded with wet leaves and a long black shape that didn't look like a root or a snake. It was an object, squared off at the end, wedged exactly in the gap where the water should draw. I squatted in the gate like an idiot trying to fix a sink and reached. The shape was slick and cool, but the edges under my fingers were precise. My brain told me what it was before I pulled it free. The harmonica was old tin, the kind with star stamps on the sides and letters that said something I couldn't read under the water film. I cupped it in my hand and the hum under the stairs deepened. It was as if removing the object released a tone that had been waiting to fill the space. The radio on my shoulder coughed and spit out Tasha's voice clipped into pieces. Do not. The interior? Daniel? That made my heart lift in a stupid way until the static swelled again, and a sound came through that wasn't her at all. It was a human hum, like a person singing without words from the other side of a wall. Low and steady, patient in a way that raised the skin on my scalp. I had the harmonica in my hand and the drain intake right there filling with leaves again. The forced choice tilted. I could jam the harmonica back in to choke the flow and keep the hum where it was, stop it from resonating the stone. Or I could keep it out, clear the intake, let the water pull, and risk whatever voice wanted to swell to fill the empty. I went practical because that's who I am. I cleared the leaves, jammed my fingers into cold water stinking of tannins until the gap showed open black. When I pushed the harmonica in to use it like a grill, the tone changed. It stepped up a fifth, clear as church training. I pulled it back out on reflex and the tone dropped. When the wind gusted, the note swelled and a higher melody brushed against my ear, a clause without words. The harmonica was a reed in a pipe. The stairs and the crawl space were the body of the instrument. I had stumbled into a century-old organ that played itself in storms. The choice became something else then. I could keep the harmonica, silence the play, take the charm out of the place and stop the hum that made my bones clench. Or I could respect the stupid story, set the instrument where it belonged, and accept that a musician's trick had built a tiny, unasked-for voice into the stone. Somewhere between those thoughts, the radio gave me Tasha whole. "Do not remove anything from an interment," she said, slow, like I was a rookie. "Document, not disturb." She didn't know what I held. It didn't matter. The job is the job. I slid the harmonica back into the gap with both hands this time, lining the holes with the flow. The note rose and then settled into a long, even hum that made the steps give small ticks as if they were adjusting to a new old tension. The water drew hard, gurgled, and the puddle dropped back to a sheen. I stayed there with my hands braced on cold stone and let my breathing fall into that tone. The cemetery has eaves that don't move, and under them I felt like I had put a tiny engine back where it belonged. The wind ran a scale and then leveled off. I took my hands away and the stone was a stone again. Cold, heavy, obedient to gravity and weather, but not to me. When I stood, the radio barked again, and a voice that wasn't Tasha came through the open channel like a person speaking from a pocket against cloth. 3 sounds, close together. Not words, not even notes. It was what you make when you tug a bell rope slowly 3 times without the bell ever finishing the peal. It was as soft as breath on glass. I said my own name out loud to return myself to myself, then called in that the drains were clear. I did not say what I had done. I did not say what I had heard. Tasha told me to come back to the watch house and log it. I locked the gate and the Yale made that very human click. The brass key felt heavy, its shape familiar in my palm, the notch near the head like a small healed wound in metal. I wiped it on my jacket and my hand smelled like pennies. When I stepped back, my boot slid on algae. The hum stayed low, hardly more than a suggestion under the rain. I put my hand on the step one last time and felt it in me like a sympathetic string vibrating to a note you didn't choose. The rain eased as if the sky had remembered how to breathe. I logged everything because that is what buys you mercy in someone else's book. Cleared drain by Arsenault. Water receded, no damage. I wrote with the slow printing I use after midnight so I don't bungle numbers. My pen left darker ink on that line than the others. The watch house had that quiet after a scare where the clock seems to tick louder and paper makes a sound. The Dietz lantern on the shelf chose that moment to light itself in my memory, and the idea bothered me enough that I went to it. I trimmed the wick again, set a match to it, and watched the flame steady like a thing learning a balance. The room took on a gold tone that pushed the orange out of the window a little. Marcel showed up before dawn because he always does when the weather badgers him in his sleep. He knocked his 2 light beats on the gate, and I let him in, and he did the thing with his earlobe before he even took his hood down. "You listen to the drains, Cher?" he said, voice soft to fit the hour, and I told him the truth that water had pulled strong behind Arsenault and I had cleared it. He sniffed the air the way he sniffs coffee. The vinegar metal smell faint now that the rain had settled into a thin curtain. "They sang?" he asked without irony. I said I heard something under the steps. He shook rain off his hat brim and didn't look at me when he said, "Storms teach stone their songs." The storm gave up fully around 6. The sodium lamps clicked off and the gray coming over the oaks was the color of a clean sheet. I did one last walk, partly to check the puddles, partly because the place never feels like a place you can leave without asking it if it minds. The floral cone had finally let go and lay on its side, the red dye washed thin. Benny's whistle wasn't in the air, but I could imagine it. The Dandridge plate said Dandridge, solid and normal, raised letters catching pale light. I paused at the Arsenault steps and put my knuckles on the stone where a person might knock on wood. Nothing sounded back but rain finding a new path in the leaves. Tasha came at 7 with her clipboard and pencil and the words, "Document, not disturb," already in place behind her teeth. She asked me to show her where the water had pooled. I did and said nothing else. She crouched by the step and touched the edge of the drain intake, and her face made the professional neutral, the way I guess mine does when I don't want to give myself away. "We'll note it," she said. "Good call." When she stood, the pencil skated behind her ear and she breathed in through her nose. "Do you smell that?" she asked. I said only the rain. She shook her head. "Something like copper. We let that sit between us, not heavy, just true." I handed the brass keys to Marcel and his palm swallowed them like they'd never left. He hooked the ring to his belt and patted the keys the way men pat pockets to count their lives. He told me Miss Inez had called at 5 to ask if the lilies were still upright, mothball and sugar in her voice even over the line, and that Mr. Landry had already left a message about a candle he meant to leave later. "The city wakes up like that around the dead," It surprised me less than it used to. On my way out, I put my hand on the watch house door frame the way I do to feel the grain. The wood was cold, damp in a way that would pass when the sun did any kind of work. The air inside had that paper starch smell that comes from 100 years of logs and one stubborn lantern wick, and the jackets of men who carry rain into rooms. I heard a faint thread of sound then from under the little stoop, so soft it might have been my own blood in my ear. I bent down because of course I did. The tone under the step matched nothing, a single patient hum that rose a hair when a breeze went under the door. It made me think of tin, of a mouthpiece, of a thing lined with holes that waited for wind. I said goodbye to Marcel, and he lifted 2 fingers without looking, eyes on the ledger. At the gate road, the world beyond was starting to sound like cars again. The cemetery behind me breathed its soft stone breath. As I stepped onto Washington, a gust moved the oaks and the little hum under the watch house stoop rose enough to make a shape in the air. The outline of a melody that once belonged to a man who wanted to be buried with the thing that taught his fingers. I paused without meaning to. The sound slipped back into itself. 3 times, very slowly, something like a voice without breath tugged at the morning, and then the day took the frequency away. I walked on with the weight of a brass key no longer in my pocket and the note of it in my teeth. And if I'm quiet at my kitchen sink now, sometimes I swear I hear that faint humming beneath my own steps. The first sound was the rattle of a nameplate on the Levy family stone, a thin metal clink against granite that came from nowhere because the wind had died. The second was the thud of damp soil settling in a plot we hadn't opened in years. The third was the ring of water down the bell pipe at the chapel, like a finger sliding a rim. My mag light cut a pale cone through drizzle and sodium fog, and I was halfway down the gate road when I realized the smell in the air was wrong. I'm the night watch at Mountain View Cemetery in Catawissa this winter, hired because kids have been daring each other to climb the old caged grave of Sarah Ann Boone, and because the township wants eyes on the grounds after midnight. I'm 38, retired early from the county maintenance crew after a back injury, which means 2 things. I know a lot about locks and I hate ladders. The township gave me a Motorola radio with a dead belt clip, a ring of brass keys, and a laminated plot map with coffee stains that make the chapel look like it's got a lake. The grave sits in a tangle of brush up the hill along the older rows, a black iron box around a sunken rectangle of earth, and the lock they put on its little gate is a Yale padlock that sticks in cold weather. I've logged 3 weeks of nights with the cold drizzle that never stops, sodium lamps buzzing like hornets, and that smell I couldn't name at first. It's like hot pennies in white vinegar, not septic, not rot, just a sharp metallic bite that digs at the back of the throat. We were 3 on the rotation. Earl over day shift is a cheerful man with a busted knuckle that won't bend, and a thermos that always smells like cinnamon coffee. He whistles old hymns without realizing even when he shovels clay. Nina volunteers with the Historical Society. Her gloves are always speckled with oil-based paint, and she talks to the stones when she wipes lichen off dates. She said the caged grave was Sarah Ann Boone's because the local paper said so in the 50s, and the 50s never let go. Deputy Morales swings through on patrol after midnight. He keeps a toothpick in his cheek and tells me to text him if teens or copper thieves show up. He also hates the place, which he says is because of the deer staring from the tree line like jurors. The first week was procedural. Check the gate chain and padlock on the front drive. Walk the gate road to the watch house with the warped windows. Static on the Motorola until the top of the hill where the repeater catches. Record a sweep time in the ledger. The battery lantern they left in the watch house for me had a wick that wouldn't stay lit past a minute, which is ridiculous because it's not a wick lantern, it's LED, but that is exactly how it looked, like a wick that guttered. Earl laughed when I told him and swapped me a different lantern. That one died too, only when I stood near the iron cage. I started bringing my mag light and spare D-cells in my pack and stopped telling Earl things that made me sound superstitious. The first anomaly was small and stupid. Plot 7B on the old hill has a little flag with a brass grommet that Earl plants for veterans on weekends. I logged the flag at 02:15 by habit. At 03 Boismoro, cutting back from the chapel, I saw the flag again, bright as a tongue in my beam, as if I had not just passed it. I checked my clock, walked over and found the same grommet with the same scratch shaped like a fishhook. I flipped the plot map to find 7B and saw it had never been assigned a veteran. The name there was M. Kershaw, and the tag had been pulled in 2019 because the family said he hated flags. We had his grandson in the book last summer, Tommy Reddick, who came out with an inhaler that rattled when he laughed and told us to keep the plot tidy. I took the flag up to the watch house and left it on the desk. In the morning it wasn't there. The second anomaly wasn't mine. Nina told me she found the chapel door relocked from the inside, with the Yale bolt slid and the key still in the exterior cylinder. You can do that if you've got delicate hands and patience. But there was rust inside the bolt and it hadn't been thrown in years. She showed me the superstitious protection bundle someone had tied under the stone step. A twist of thread, a dead moth, a nail. She was matter of fact, but her hands worked faster as she talked and she kept rubbing her thumb along a paint blister until it burst like a bubble. By the third week, I had convinced myself the smell was a plumbing thing. The old columbarium wall has a drain behind it that floods when the ground is heavy. You can get a metallic tang off anoxic water. I ran water from the spigot by the caretaker shed and tasted iron. Earl rolled his eyes and said we weren't running plumbing up to the old hill for me, then flicked the brim of his cap and told me to go up and look at the cage at the top of the long breath, which is what he calls the hill because the path takes it out of you. It takes 2 breaths under drizzle to get from the watch house to the caged grave when the fog sits low. My maglite makes a crisp tunnel, and the rest of the world holds its breath. Every time I came up there, I smelled that vinegar metal, faint like a jar opened a room away. It was sharper around the cage. Earl had brushed fresh Rust-Oleum on the outside, but you could see the flaking red asthma from the inside bars, as if a wet tongue licked them. The family stones near it read Boone, Klein, Dombrowski, and my beam picked up a little cluster of moths under the cage roof even when everything else was damp. The placard at the foot explains nothing. In the lantern glow you could read the rumor and you could read the date, 1852, and you could laugh at the word witch without moving your mouth. At first I told myself kids were climbing and touching it. Hand oils can do strange things to iron. I greased the Yale lock and made sure the chain on the little gate was tight, though anyone could slip between the bars if they wanted. I took pictures in case we needed to report vandalism. The photos always came out bluish and blurred unless my hand was on the cage. When I touched it, every shot was crisp. One night Morales came up the hill with me. He had his toothpick and his portable speaker playing a Spanish ballad under his breath, which is against policy, but I didn't care. We heard a hum underneath the chapel steps on the way, a low electrical-sounding thing. He checked the breaker box and found nothing tripped, no floodlight left on. When we stood over the cage, he said the smell made his eyes water. He called it tamarind gone bad. His radio picked up a chirp and then a steady, hollow beep, like a monitor in a hospital ward. He turned it off, turned it on again, and the same beep came back. We walked away from the cage and it stopped. He said the repeater must be catching interference off the hill and left it at that, because it's easier to say that than talk about what the hill feels like. The third week, a Wednesday, I checked the front gate at 2352 and it was locked with 2 chains and 1 padlock, correct. At 01:05, coming back from the far perimeter where deer graze near the freight tracks, I found the gate secured with 1 chain and 2 padlocks, one of which belonged to no one on staff. It was a cheap gym lock kind you can buy with cash at the hardware store. I texted Morales. He took 15 minutes and came out with bolt cutters. The rain fell in a slant and made tiny needles in the sodium light. He snipped the cheap lock, tagged it with a zip tie through the shackle so we could keep it for records, and then stood with his head cocked for a heartbeat. He said, "Do you smell that?" And I said, "Yes." We looked up the hill to where the lamps barely touched the black box of the cage, and I thought I saw a pale shape behind the bars not moving. We both swung our lights and found only the pale towel of lichen on the Boone stone. You convince yourself with stories that you're doing a job that keeps you from being nervous. You call it perimeter. You call it procedure. You call it a sweep. The ledger in the watch house has boxes for every 15 minutes and I put neat times in them, so the morning looks straight. I wrote names and little tags to keep me sane. Mr. Kershaw pipe tobacco even though there is no smoke. Mrs. Dombrowski perfume like lavender soap though nothing else smells like anything but rain and metal. Father Callahan wet wool jacket, only the name on his stone is Callahan with an A and there is no jacket. I told myself it was a way of noticing. I didn't tell Nina because she writes names in a respectful hand that looks like scripture, and my notes would make her frown. They told me the cage rusts from inside. That was the talk at Rocco's diner when Morales was off shift. Earl loves telling it, but he shakes his head after and says it's just water wicking up from the soil and condensing under the roof. He said Sarah Ann Boone was only accused in whispers and was more likely a fever victim, buried in summer when the ground went sour. He said the cage kept animals off the grave, and when you leave iron in a damp box long enough, the oxygen eats it. After a pause, he added that he had painted the inner bars twice in his life, and both times the paint flaked in curls by the next season, and both times the inside of the lock turned black, like a pipe that had burned. The smell was stronger on Friday. It wasn't wind-driven because there was no wind. The drizzle made everything smell wet the way a sponge smells. But over that came the vinegar metal that made me think of pickling nails in a jar. The little LED in my pocket behaved until my boots touched the mud churn by the cage, and then the light banded, a strobe in my eyelid when I blinked. The mag light stayed steady. I touched the bars and they felt warm the way a coin in your mouth feels warm. The Yale key on the ring fit too perfectly like a tooth in a socket. I don't know why I tried it, but I did. The padlock turned and clicked, and a smell like a bottle uncapped rolled up. Iron and vinegar. Then somewhere in it a sweet edge like old apples. I locked it again and told myself I hadn't unlocked it, though the chain had slacked for a breath. I made the mistake of breathing too close to the bars and tasting metal. I stepped back and put my hand on the Boone nameplate, the letters sharp from weather. For a second I thought I felt a tremor through the ground like a truck passing. But we don't get trucks up here at 2 in the morning, and it might have been my own pulse in my hand. It built in small things after that. The chapel door left ajar and then closed before I reached it. The lantern on the watch house desk shifting an inch to the left of the coffee ring I'd left it in. The same date carved into 2 different stones down in row C, July 19, 1959, one a Klein and one a Snyder, which could be coincidence but looked like someone copying by habit. Nina found a nameplate screw sitting in a bird bath and asked if I had pulled it for repair, which I had not. I wrote it all in the ledger because that was the only place I knew to put it. Earl wrote "Do not dramatize" in red pen by my list of dates, and I took the hint and did not talk to him about warm iron. On the night it went bad, the rain thickened from drizzle to a thoughtful, steady fall that made curtains under the lamps. The air felt low. Morales called to say the rail police had a trespasser down by the freight and asked me to keep my eyes on the far fence until he looped back. I walked the perimeter to the columbarium. The drain gurgled and the metallic smell was there at my shoulder like a person who doesn't know distance. I checked the chapel and found a damp boot print on the stone step toes pointing out, which could have been Earl at dusk. But Earl has a limp that makes his right footprint shallow, and these were even. I went up the hill and saw by the time I reached the bend that the cage front was open, the chain on the ground like a tongue. The Yale lock hung by its shackle in the hasp, closed but not threaded through. I wanted Morales there, but the Motorola coughed and cut, and I got only a hiss of carrier. I could have turned and waited by the chapel in light. Instead, I kept walking because I had the key ring and because I was half a man who ran crews and not just a man afraid of a story. The smell hit hard, white vinegar on a penny, coppery sweet, and the drizzle stung my eyelids. The iron bars were wet like a hand that had held them. I swung the mag light and the beam made a clean, bright rectangle on the grave and the shallow depression inside the cage. It is not deep enough to swallow a man if he lies there. The grass inside is sparse and the dirt is always dark. I stepped to the mouth of the cage and saw that someone had pushed a brass key through the links onto the dirt on the inside. It was my key, not a copy. The key I had in my pocket was a twin because the head had the same scratch across the Yale stamp, only this one was inside. I looked at my key ring and felt the shape through my glove. I had it. It had weight and cold. I looked at the one in the dirt and imagined reaching through. The bar gap is narrow. If I slipped my arm in, my elbow would bind. I could use the mag light to nudge the key, but the mag light is what I would need if I had to back away fast. I broke the rule I had made for myself and said out loud that it was not funny. Rain tapped the iron roof. I tried the radio again and got Morales' voice in a thin thread. He said, "Say that again," and then nothing, as if he had stepped down a stair and out of range. I heard water travel inside the bell pipe near the chapel, even though I couldn't see the chapel from here. The sodium light made umbrellas of halos. The cage looked like a black rib cage open on one side. I put the keys back in my pocket and did the thing that made no sense. I stepped inside. You close your eyes and then you walk and then you open them or you fall. I kept them open and the drizzle felt different inside. The smell was stronger. I reached down and took the brass key from the dirt, and as my fingers closed on the head, my head filled with a hot metallic pressure, as if a blood pressure cuff had cinched at my temples. It passed. Or it stayed, and I noticed other things. The interior bars had a film-like sweat. The cross pieces were pitted and the pits were clean, as if something had polished them from the inside. The dirt below my boots had that look it gets when something heavy has sat, a smoothness like a cast coming out of a mold. My breath tasted like apples left too long in a drawer, sweet and sharp. I backed out of the cage with the key in my hand and slid the Yale lock through the hasp and chain without thinking, because you always resecure before you call. I turned my back to the cage to see if a beam was coming up the hill, if Morales' headlights were cutting the fog on the gate road. I gripped the brass key I had picked up and realized it was not just similar to mine. It was mine. The scratch on the head had the same small pull at the tail of the letter, the way I had done it dropping it on the watch house step last week. I held both keys in my palm. I closed my fingers and the static climbed my wrist. The radio slid a voice in soft as breath. It was a woman's voice, not Morales, not Nina. It said, "Don't let it out," and then it was gone under the hiss. I looked at the locked cage and thought of what letting out would be. There is nothing alive in there. There is only a box and earth. Letting out is a phrase you put on fear when fear asks for a handle. It gives it one. The handle felt like the brass keys in my hand. The hum under the hill rose then. It wasn't the chapel. It was a vibration through the soles of my boots, and the bars shivered the way a glass sings when you rub a wet finger along its rim. The drizzle slanted as if the air had leaned. I saw through the bars a light like phone glow, blue and wavering low to the ground inside the rectangle. It distorted the corners of the cage and made the bars look as if they were bending in, and my hands went slick and I dropped one key. It rang once in my palm and then jumped as if someone had flicked it. I grabbed for the lock and had the thought, clear and useless, that if the chain failed at that second, I would not try to rethread it. I would run. I heard a metal rattle against stone down the row, something like a nameplate shaken. I heard the hollow beep again from Morales' radio, and then my own voice in my head saying a simple word, no. I put the loose key back on the ring. I put the ring in my pocket. I put my left hand on the lock and felt heat through my glove, and I didn't think locks generate heat by themselves in rain. The maglite beam went thin like a skewer, and then fat again as if the air had widened behind it. In the beam, I saw the dirt inside the cage smooth. Then I saw a convex bulge roll toward the iron like the back of a fish in a dark river. It didn't break the surface. It didn't even press the grass. It rolled a shape without edges. I don't know what I would have done beyond freeze if Morales hadn't called my name right then from the bend. Voice tight and close as if he had been standing behind me. He came up fast with his toothpick tucked away and his hand on his belt clip. And the second he stepped into the wide halo of the lamp, the hum dropped to a low sound you could hide under a truck hood. He said, "What is that smell?" and coughed. I said the lock was off and then on, and that my key was in my pocket and in my hand and then only in my pocket again. He turned and looked at the chain, and we both saw the padlock in the hasp, threaded right. He put his knuckle on it and pulled back like he had touched a stove. He said, "Don't touch that." He said it like a dad and a cop, and I nodded because it felt like both, and because in that second the idea of opening it was obscene the way an open electrical panel in floodwater is obscene. Raised his light and that blue phone glow under the bars winked out. The smell hung. He asked if I had seen anyone. I said no. He asked if I had been inside, and I said yes, and he blew a breath through his teeth that made a drop of water jump off the bar and darken the dirt. He said we were calling this in and getting the township up here at dawn to weld the lock shut. He said a chain wasn't enough. He said a story wasn't enough. I liked him for that last part in a way that had teeth to it. We spent the next hour moving from light to light across the older rows. Rain slicked the stones. The columbarium drain gurgled. When we passed the chapel, the bell pipe coughed a ring. The Motorola talked in half words that didn't carry. He keyed his car radio and got dispatch and asked for a drive-by at dawn by the DPW. When we came back to the cage near 3, the smell had thinned to the metallic breath of pennies in your hand. I reached to test the lock without thinking, and Morales caught my wrist without looking at me and shook his head once. We stood there while the rain stitched little lines in the mud. He told me a story about a boy at St. Ignatius who dared him to sleep in the organ loft and how the hymn book pages turned themselves, which is the kind of story that keeps the mind above your knees. I told him about the flag with the little fishhook scratch on the grommet and how it had been in a plot with no veteran. He said we mislog things, and then he looked at the inside of the cage where the bars freckled from beneath, and he stopped talking about mislogging. At dawn, Earl came up with a steel saw in the back of his truck and a length of hardened chain. He took off his cap and his whistling stopped when he saw the padlock in the hasp. He said nothing for a long minute, then set down the chain like a man putting down a heavy baby. Nina arrived with her gloves and a hot thermos that smelled like the inside of a bakery. She didn't touch anything. She stood at the corner of the cage and read the Boonstone in a voice that tried to be paper. The drizzle softened, but the lamp stayed on because the light sensors were blind in this fog. Earl asked if the lock was hot, and Morales nodded. Earl put on leather gloves and touched, flinched, and then used a hooded socket to flick it. The metal made a tiny complaint. We waited. Morales stepped back and took his toothpick from his pocket and put it in his mouth and then took it out, because it tasted like the air. I showed Earl the key. I showed him both keys. He turned them in his gloved hand and found the scratch. He did not say anything about twins or copies. He got the bolt cutter from his truck and set the jaws on the shackle. The Yale was old but stout. He squeezed and the cut bit a hair and stopped. He set the metal down and went for the steel. The saw wouldn't catch. He pulled the cord and pulled again. The motor coughed. He checked the fuel and there was fuel. Nina said lightly that iron remembers, and I wanted to tell her to take that back. Morales said we could weld later and used a little pry bar to twist the hasp enough to unthread the chain. Earl slid the chain out like a snake from a fence. We braced. Morales looked at me and said, ready, like we were lifting a couch. He swung the door. It creaked no more than any gate. The smell did not surge. The dirt inside looked like dirt. I hated all of that. We pushed the chain through the mesh at the bolt points, and Earl rethreaded it such that the lock would be outside the halo where the heat had been. He clicked the padlock on and shook it twice. The clang rang in the bars like a thin bell. We stood like men who had just lifted something heavy that had not resisted. The sun did not rise. It just got paler. We filled out an incident report in the watch house. Earl wrote with rain spots on the paper, and Nina kept her gloves on even indoors. I wrote about the inside key. Morales wrote about the smell because he could not write about it. Earl started whistling again without hearing himself, and then stopped on an off note that made us all look up. The day shift crew came in with wet backpacks. The names I know from the ledger drifted through the watch house like ghosts getting coffee. Kershaw pipe tobacco was not there. Dombrowski lavender was not there. Only people with damp hair and actual tasks and a smell of wet wool and diesel. We went back up in daylight and there was nothing to see that we had not already seen. I sleep days in a rented room above the bait shop. I woke around noon to the taste of metal in my mouth and sat up with my hand at my throat. The room smelled like a jar someone had forgotten to rinse. I put my keys on the table and counted them because that is the sort of thing I do now. 2 Yale heads, one with the scratch, one without. I dropped them in my palm and they were both cool. I told myself I was doing a job where you get smells on you like fish or oil or paint. I told myself that vinegar metal is a kind of weather. I worked 2 more nights. The drizzle kept. The sodium lamps buzzed with a sound like bees trapped in a lampshade. The LED lantern they gave me stood its ground. The Motorola worked within reason. I walked the gate road and recorded times. At 2:15 on Sunday, the bell pipe in the chapel sang a single note as water fell. And I smiled in spite of myself because it was ordinary, and not all horror stories end in terror, some end in maintenance. Then I turned my light at the hill and saw the cage in its square of lamps, and I smelled the vinegar metal out of nowhere as sharp as a slap. I went up. The padlock hung in the hasp, threaded right, cool to the touch. Inside the cage, on the dirt at the foot of the Boonstone, lay a brass key where a brass key had no reason to be. This one did not have my scratch. It had a different one, a crescent like a thumbnail. I had seen that mark in the watch house when Nina set her keys down beside her thermos last week. I stood there with the drizzle knitting between the bars and almost called her, then didn't, then wanted to again. On impulse, I looked down at my hand, at the little wiry hair on the back of it, at the rain beating there. I pressed my palm to the iron and felt warmth that did not belong to a cold morning. I breathed in and tasted copper. I locked my mouth around the taste and stepped back. I didn't reach through. I didn't open anything. I did not fix what I could not understand. I put the ring of keys back in my pocket, and I turned my mag light off for one breath and then on again like a man checking the world was still there. The air smelled clean for one instant like stone and wet moss, and then the vinegar metal slid back under it, faint, like a jar lid sealed in place. I walked down to the watch house and wrote nothing in the ledger because sometimes you learn that writing a name makes it come when you say it. At dawn, I locked the main gate and put my hand on the chill bar. When I let go, my fingers were clean. On the far hill, the cage sat like a throat around a breath you can't see. When I tell it now, I say it straight. The grave has a cage built to keep something in. The iron flakes from the inside no matter who paints it. The lock goes hot when you stand where you shouldn't. The smell finds you if you think its name. Some nights you get a key in your hand that should not exist and you think opening would be an answer. It isn't. The answer is weight. Weight on a chain. Weight of a story that sits on a hill and wants to be let out of its words. When I wake these days, I smell pennies and vinegar only faintly like the memory of a taste. And in the second before I open my eyes, I hear the soft, dry sound of metal under rain. Then it stops, and the room is only air. And I listen for it and do not hear it, and the silence has that high, bright edge that makes you think of a jar lid sealing with a click. The sound that made me look up was a little click like a nameplate settling on a crosswind. I was halfway down the gate road, rain ticking off my hood, just doing my third sweep of the perimeter when the second sound came from the chapel. Bell pull, a rope twitch so slight it would have been nothing if the bell hadn't answered with a dull, throat clearing deep in the rafters. Then soil popped somewhere to my right like a jar lid easing, and the night came back in around me. I'm a 32-year-old night guard at San Fernando Cemetery, the side that backs up to the old houses and the freight spur. Third week on stations, covering for Hector's knee. Cold drizzle, sodium lamps making everything bruise-colored. I had the West Keys in the ledger, and I was supposed to keep an eye on the mausoleum row because of the children's vault they pulled up during the day. The daytime crew had been buzzing about that little sarcophagus all week. Most of the talk was gallows humor. Bet you it's full of rattlers, get Hector to open it with his boot. But when they actually cut the slab loose, the mood shifted. Luis, who runs grounds and never wears a hat no matter the weather, came into the watch house white as chalk and said only that there was a stone baby, and he wasn't signing any more work orders. Marta from the office, peppermint gum forever in her cheek, put a yellow sticky on the ledger. San Antonio Historical wants it secured, do not disturb. I wasn't there for the discovery. By the time I took over that evening, the little vault had been hauled into the old caretaker shed and tarped. Even with the door closed, the shed seemed to cool the air around it like a plugged drain. I like quiet posts.
I don't spook easy.
I grew up a few blocks from here and rode a skateboard along the outside wall until the groundsman ran us off. The thing about quiet is you hear the wrong quiet the minute it happens, an absence with edges. The cemetery has its regular noises, the hiss of the lamps, the highway is a constant river, the bump of a possum in the ivy, the wheeze of the bell rope when the breeze catches it. The wrong quiet came after the bell thudded. It dropped everything out of the middle of the sound picture, so the high things and the wet things stayed and the rest got swallowed. In that quiet, I heard the first humming under the mausoleum steps. It was faint. So faint I thought I was feeling it through my boots rather than hearing it. A single note, child high without being sweet. The row of family mausolea on the north side have limestone steps that sweat in cold weather. In the drizzle, they were dark and slick, each one with a little iron gate or Yale lock flanked by urns. I put my hand on my mag light and the note evaporated. When I climbed the steps to the Alvarado vault and shined the beam down into the crack at the bottom of the door, all I got back was the dry sift of falling grit and the pale flash of a spider. I told myself it was a drainpipe resonance. I walked on, made marks in the ledger, and told the radio that Gate 1 was still latched. The first hour rolled by, an ordinary nuisance. Someone had relocked the east pedestrian gate from the outside, padlock hanging where it shouldn't, and I had to bring out the long brass key from my ring to snake through and test the catch. The key is older than my job. It's the kind you feel in your palm the way you feel an old coin, smooth in some places, grained in others. The Narvaez plot was mislogged, the index number chalked on the inside of the cover instead of on the spine. I fixed it with a pencil from my breast pocket. The chapel wick wouldn't take the flame and kept tunneling along the wax, so I left it dark and made a note for Marta with a little box to tick. A family had brought plastic flowers in a shopping bag and abandoned the bag under a live oak. and I tucked it into the Fiskar's bin near the watch house to keep raccoons from nosing it into the road. Hector limped in around 9 with a carton of coffee and a pack of cigarettes he doesn't smoke but always carries. He's 60, still thick through the shoulders the way men get from lifting wet concrete. He's got a habit of counting on his fingers when he thinks, pinky touching thumb, then the next like he's tallying ghosts. "You hear the story?" he asked, not bothering to pour his coffee. Rain streaked his glasses. "The rock boy, stone child," I said. "Luis told me not to touch it." "He's dramatic," Hector said, and touched his pinky to his thumb. "But he's not wrong. I was there. They cracked the lid and it didn't smell. Not like old bones. It smelled like nails, like when you sniff a handful of screws. Only thing you saw was little ribs, all mineral. We put the lid back and I signed out. I figured, okay, they're going to put a guard on that door tonight. Save your ankles for the dogs, not for me." He didn't step into the shed. He didn't look at it. "Don't ring the bell," he said finally, as if we rang it for fun. "Somebody told a story about bells and children. I don't know it. I don't want to know it." He left his coffee with me, and his radio crackled 3 minutes later with him asking for the code to the tool cage, and then, forget it, I remember. When he walked away, he did that thing with his fingers again, counting something I couldn't see. If I had turned around right then and gone home, I'd be fine. That's the thought I had later, sitting on the steps and listening to the humming, wishing I had chosen a different night for overtime. The humming came back when I passed the Perales mausoleum, one down from Alvarado. Same single high note like air blown across a bottle, except it wasn't wind. I bent and put my hand flat on the bottom step. The stone vibrated enough to set a pulse somewhere under my ring. I pressed my ear to the riser and heard what might have been a radio so far down in the concrete, it was only the carrier wave. My Motorola on my shoulder stayed quiet. The watch house checked in on the hour, and it was 8:57. I told myself the drain under the row was clogged, water bridging across a pipe and making a tone. By the time the watch house gave me the 9 o'clock call, I had written, "Huming?" next to 3 different vault names. Marta's sticky fluttered up out of the ledger when I turned a page. I pushed it back down. It was cold enough that when I exhaled, the plume drifted sideways toward the steps. At 9:15, a woman in a yellow slicker tapped on the gate. She had a squeaky rain jacket and hair cropped close to her head. She introduced herself as Officer Ruiz and asked for the sign-in sheet because someone had reported hearing kids in the cemetery. I signed her in and walked her to the perimeter path, my maglite beam skipping from puddle to puddle. A man under a live oak looked back at us from a folding chair, his wool cap smelling faintly of cedar. He lifted a gloved hand to show he wasn't sleeping. Ms. Delgado's family had left a small candle burning on the lip of her husband's headstone, and the air near it was warm and smelled like lemon. Father Esteban stopped under the bell tower and said a prayer into the hood of his coat. Tobacco hung heavy on his breath. The cemetery wasn't dead at night, not empty anyway. People came with their reasons. Ruiz walked like someone doing math with her feet. When I told her about the humming, she said, "Underground lines. City does weird things with utilities." She shone her light into the crack under Perales and said, "If there are kids, they're smaller and braver than I was." She checked out at 9:40, leaving damp boot prints on the mat. I made it through the 10 o'clock round not quite okay. I don't want to write myself as a hero. I'm not. I started talking to myself under my breath, the way you do when you need a voice to pile sound back into a hole. I read names aloud. Laura Ortiz Galvan. I said dates, 2 October 12s in a row, then chided myself for making patterns where there weren't any. The wick in the chapel lamp let out a sound like a hair being pulled and died again. I made the note box for Marta larger, probably a petty rebellion. I stopped by the caretaker shed and set my keys on the workbench to catch them before they slid. There was that smell again, not rot, not oil. More like a handful of pennies dipped in vinegar. The tarp whispered as rain ticked on it. I put my palm over the brass key and the metal felt warm. At 11, the humming got teeth. It changed from a single note to a thin, whining chord. It tunneled into my jaw and made my molars ache. Standing over the steps, I thought of a dentist's office and a toy guitar tuned too high. I pressed my hand to the riser and felt the vibration slow as if whatever made it were listening back. That was when the gate behind me clanked. I swung the light. The small gate that leads to the service path along the family vaults was latched. The chain looped twice and hooked on. I had chained it myself at dusk to keep drunk teenagers out. Now the chain hung open like a drawn curtain. There were wet shoe prints on the flagstone beyond, small and narrow, leading up 3 steps and then stopping like the person had stepped into the stone. I put the beam down at my own boots and saw my tracks. Then I angled the light and saw the small ones weren't mine and weren't old. The edges were wet. You can look at a print and know if it's fresh the way you know a cut on your hand is fresh. There's a shine to it. The humming shifted down a half step. It made a shape in the air, almost a word. I closed my mouth and it lived on my tongue anyway. My radio coughed dead air. I told myself the little stone child in the shed had nothing to do with little wet prints by a mausoleum at 11 at night. I told myself 100 things while I followed the prints up 2 more steps. At the gate of the Sanchez vault, a Yale lock hung with its keyhole turned down, rain threading the keyway. The prints faded before the threshold. I put my hand on the brass lock and my hand came away cold as if I had touched ice that had thought about fire. The humming climbed. The choice that got me was simple. I could wake Louise, who hates being woken. I could call Ruiz and have her come back with more officers and piss off everyone on the night, including the woman in the folding chair. Or I could use the old brass key and see if the sound was some stupid trick of pressure. The ledger said the Sanchez vault key was in the set marked North Vaults, which hung on the same ring as the gate key. The shape of that old brass key in my palm decided for me more than anything. It's a comfort, a thing you can hold up and say, "This is my tool and I am allowed to use it." I told the radio I was doing a maintenance check on a lock. No one answered. The mag light in my teeth made my jaw rattle. The key slid into the Yale and stopped, then eased past the grit with a soft clink. I turned, the sound cut out, silence fell so fast I staggered. It was like stepping out of a vibrating room. For a second, with the chain of the gate in my elbow and the brass head of the key under my thumb, I tasted metal on my tongue. I pushed the door an inch. Cold air unfurled like dry ice. My beam made a thick chalk line in the chamber, carving out niches and white marble faces. Names drifted past like fish. There was a whisper from the back, not a voice, more like a shoe sliding on grit. I put 1 foot over the threshold. The drizzle had slowed and drops ticked in the street as if they were in another city. I said my name out loud in the exact voice I use when I enter a room at home in case my sister's kid is playing hide and seek. A child's laugh answered me. It wasn't funny. It was the sound an adult makes when a child tells a joke and the adult wants to keep the child talking. I froze with my heel over the second step. The laugh came from under the floor. The humming rose through the stone, faint, the same note as before. I took my foot back out, closed the door, and relocked it with hands that didn't feel attached to me. The key came out clean. When I looked down, water beaded on the back of my glove as neatly as if someone had spit on it. I didn't go back to the shed then. I cut a path along the perimeter, hit the watch house, and flipped the heater on. The clock over the coffee machine ticked off a minute where my heart could climb back down out of my throat. The security camera monitor showed nothing I could interpret. Soft blobs of light, a halo on the bell tower. I thought about calling Marta at home because she believes every bad thing is a form you can fill out. Then I thought about Luis's face when he came in from the stone child and said he was done. The thing with being alone is that if you move quickly, you can outrun your imagination. I took the keys and the maglite and the ledger and I went back out at 11:40. Because if I waited until midnight, I would never leave the watch house again. This is where everything starts to stack on itself. Beats too close to separate. I saw the bag I'd stowed flutter out of the Fiskar's bin with nobody near it. The chapel lamp guttered and caught, then snuffed. The gate at the service path I had relocked hung open again, chain on the flagstone like a comma. The humming didn't wait for me this time. It ran out along the row ahead of me, vault to vault. A vibration that made the air ripply around my eyes. On the third set of steps, I met Officer Ruiz coming the other way, her radio held between 2 fingers like she was pinching a wasp. "Got a call," she said. Kid laughing. "Not your voice?" "No kids," I said, and wanted very badly to be a liar. We moved together down the steps. The drizzle sprayed our faces. The air smelled like the inside of a coin jar. We reached the small side door of the caretaker's shed at the same time as the humming slid into a cord so wide and thin it erased the pressure in my ears. Ruiz's hand went to the back of her neck. "Static," she said, as if that explained it. The shed's Yale lock looked old and clean. The brass key waited on my ring like it had all along. I pushed it in and turned. The door gave us a warmer darkness. I wanted to be an idiot and announce us, but Ruiz pulled her hand down, 2 fingers over her lips. The tarp was shaped like a shrouded crib against the workbench. Rain tapped the roof with the rhythm of a slow walk. We stood there listening. Maybe 30 seconds passed. In the 31st second, something under the tarp laughed. It was soft and precise, the way a recording is precise. It wasn't sweet. I can't explain this without sounding cruel, but even if the laugh had belonged to a living child, it would have been wrong here. It had the exact cadence of something copied and replayed until it wore thin. The humming rose under our feet until I felt it blur the bones in my ankles. Ruiz took a step toward the tarp, then another step back as if she had run up against a leash. She tilted her head and I realized she was listening not just to the tarp but to the steps outside. The sound came up through the limestone like breath. I did the worst thing I could have done. I took the corner of the tarp between 2 fingers and folded it back. The little sarcophagus sat there with water beads gathering along its carved faces. Whoever made it had done a strange, tender job. The children's mouths were open as if they were all singing, and their eyes looked slightly to the side, not at you. The lid was cracked from earlier, the seam white and gritty. The smell that came up was that vinegar metal, stronger now, enough to make a sting in my eyes. Ruiz said my name without meaning to. I put both hands on the lid and heard a dry shuffle from the crack, like the slide of sand in a bottle. The humming budding from the floor hit a resonance with the stone box that made my teeth sing. "I need you to stop," Ruiz said. She lifted her radio, but it was already hissing, and the hiss had the same pitch as the hum. Do not lift that." "I'm not," I said. And then something under the lid tugged. I felt it in my fingers as a shift, the way you feel someone take hold of a blanket you're holding. Not strong enough to move it. Just a claim. My hands heated like I had put them near a heating vent. When I let go, the heat didn't leave. It burned in my palms as a memory of warmth. The humming dropped an octave and went quiet. The radio hiss stopped so sharply the shed had a shape again. Corners and a roof and the drip over the workbench. The laughing didn't return. We stood there too long. Standing there was a kind of permission. Ruiz holstered her radio and walked around the bench to the far side of the box. She put her palm flat on the lid the same way I had put mine on the step earlier. "There's a vibration," she said. "I can feel it through the bone." "Drain lines," I said. "City utilities." She gave me a look and then put her ear down where her hand had been. She held it there long enough for the world to find its breath again. Then she straightened and made a face that was more tired than afraid. "You need more people tomorrow," she said. "You need to seal that door and put a camera on it and move cars where they can give you headlight. Don't be here alone." She put the tarp back as if she were tucking a toddler in bed. Her jacket squeaked. "What time are you off?" "Dawn," I said. Saying it made it feel like a thing I could get to. She left at midnight after making me repeat the station phone numbers. She made me promise not to ring the bell. When I asked why, she opened her mouth and shut it and said, "Because it's night and because bells carry," and that was that. The rain had shifted to a mist that turned my light to a white post I could lean on when I needed. I sat on the steps of the Alvarado vault with my back to the iron gate, and my mag light in my lap and the brass key looped in my fingers. Somewhere between 1 and 2, the humming threaded up again, faint as breath. I did not move. I concentrated on sound resets. The hiss of lamps, the whisper of mist on my hood, the clack of a far train coupling. At 2:30, the chapel wick tried again and failed. I made a note on the ledger and tore out the page and started another because the first note looked too shaky. At 3, the gate at the service path squealed. I didn't look. I kept my eyes on the puddle in the low part of the path where a leaf had settled and made rings. Little footfalls pattered past, not on stone, but in it, the way you feel someone thumping through a floor below you. I breathed like I was trying not to fog up the inside of a mask. The humming rose enough to make the iron behind my back tick and pang like cooling stovepipe. There is a point where fear and patience are the same thing, and I learned where that point was by not moving. The thing that finally made me get up wasn't a sound. It was the brass key warming again in my hand. It went from body temperature to a little warmer than that, and there was a sudden pressing inside my teeth, a sense that something wanted to answer something. The bell rope in the chapel swayed just then. No wind, no hand. The rope's frayed end brushed the floor. The bell did not ring. If it had, I think I would have run. The idea that it might ring a certain number of times had laid itself across my head like a damp cloth. 3 slow tugs. It was nowhere in my training, nowhere on the checklist. but it owned me. I walked in a slow, stubborn line to the chapel, swinging the light across the pews, across the small table where families leave notes in a wooden box. I put my hand on the wick I had been wrestling all night, and it took the flame. It burned small and clear and steady. The humming slackened. I stood there longer than I should have, as if keeping that flame alive made me useful. Then I went back to the steps and sat down. Between 4 and 5, I dozed with my chin on my chest, and I dreamed that someone with clean, cool hands took my right hand and folded my fingers around a smaller hand that was made of stone but could move. In the dream, the stone hand squeezed. I woke with my own hand clawed around the brass key so hard my palm had the pattern of it pressed into the skin. I don't know how to write the last hour without sounding like I'm building it. I'm not. The dawn here is more a bluing up than a sunrise, because the lamps stay on until full light. The freight spur runs a last set, a quick clatter, and then there's a softening as the birds wake. I stood at the top of the mausoleum steps and watched the sky think about color. The humming was still there, faint to the point that if I turned in certain positions, it left. I turned my head to make it leave. A figure moved on the perimeter path, slow and careful, hands in pockets like he was counting something. Luis stops when he sees me sitting on a family's steps. He never says good morning as an exclamation, only as a line item. Morning, he said. Cold. Cold, I said back. He stepped up one step, then another, not looking at me. He took the brass key out of my hand without asking and turned it in his fingers. He's got that habit of not looking at things when he already knows what they are. I told you not to touch it, he said, and I waited for the lecture. It didn't come. Instead, he held the key up near his ear like he was listening to a seashell. When I was a kid, he said, my mama said never ring a bell at night here. She said that in the old days they ran ropes down to the caskets because people got buried asleep, and they tied the rope to a bell. And if the bell rang, you had to dig with your hands. He put the key back in my palm, not unkind. We found a rope when we were digging today. It was cut. No bell, just the end. I didn't tell you because you sleep here and it's useless knowledge. Now I'm telling you because maybe it's not. I don't know if he believed anything more than the effort of daylight. He went about his morning as if there weren't a stone child under a tarp in our shed and footsteps in the limestone. He waved to Ms. Delgado's daughter and took off his hat to Father Esteban and limped to the Fiskar's bin to fish out the plastic bag. He did it all like a man with a list. The lamps snapped off one by one with a little elastic sound. The mist gave up. We walked to the shed together. He held the door as if it were heavy. The tarp lay exactly as Ruiz had tucked it. The smell came up like hardware in a jar. Luis put his hand on the lid the way I had, the way the officer had, and closed his eyes. He removed his hand and looked at his palm, then at mine. He made a small, irritated noise at the welt the key had pressed there, the perfect oval and teeth of it, as if my skin had wasted paper by copying the shape. This is a church problem, he said. This is a paper problem. This is not your problem tonight. He put the tarp back down with exact corners. Go home. I left through the gate road, legs wooden, the ledger under my arm, the brass key print cooling off in my palm. The bell rope hung still. The humming, if it was there, lived in my head as a quiet buzz, the way the world sounds after a concert when you take your earplugs out. I could blame it on the heater fan, the radio, the city. The soda machine in the watch house kicked on. Marta came in, knocking her umbrella on the threshold the way she always does. Peppermint bursting up like a clean note. She looked at my face and didn't ask the question she wanted. She held out a sticky with a new box to tick. I took it. My hand left a faint gray smudge on the paper where the brass print had been. When I stepped back onto the gate road to give the walker the sidewalk, he looked up and said, "Morning," in a voice I didn't recognize. He was no one I knew. The live oaks dripped. The sun couldn't get its shoulder over the horizon yet, but the sky was on its way to a pale. I heard children then, not laughing exactly, humming. It came from the direction of the mausoleum steps, a faint thread under the heel thuds of the grounds crew, so soft I could have made it up. I told myself I wouldn't look. I told myself if I looked and saw water where there was no water, or a footprint where there should be none, I would quit like the last groundskeeper did. My mouth tasted like copper. I kept walking as the day took over, and because I kept walking, the sound stayed behind me. The last thing I heard before the gate clanged closed was the bell rope twitch against the doorframe. 3 slow tugs so soft they could have been the wind, or something under the steps trying for a voice. The tapping started first, a soft rattle of brass against stone like a spoon nudging the rim of a bowl. Then the hum rose under the chapel steps, low and steady, the kind of sound you feel through your boots before you realize you're hearing it. A windless drizzle hissed against the headstones, sodium lamps turning the raindrops the color of weak tea. I reached for the brass key in my pocket and felt it slip in my damp glove. The plaque on the door shivered again, the nameplate knocking twice, then once, as if someone on the other side wanted the sequence to mean something. I'm a 34-year-old night caretaker at Charter Street Cemetery in Salem, Massachusetts, and 3 days ago I agreed to babysit an overnight restoration team for the church's newly unearthed vault. The paper was calling it the Mirror Vault. The theory, according to the conservator, was that some 19th century believers thought lining a crypt in mirrors could reflect the soul back to heaven. I didn't argue theology. My job was to keep the gate roads locked, log movements, answer the occasional tourist who got lost sneaking in for night photos, and make sure contractors didn't die of foolishness on my watch. The team was small. Lena, the lead conservator, chewed cinnamon gum and never took off her knit cap no matter how warm or cold it was. She carried a folded plot map in a zip bag like it was a passport. Burdick, our groundskeeper, had a habit of clearing his throat and tapping his wedding ring against the Yale padlock anytime he was nervous. He'd been here longer than anyone, a man whose jokes never landed and whose keys weighed his belt down to a permanent lean. I had a Motorola radio on my shoulder and a maglite strapped to my thigh. Across the road, the church slouched behind scaffolding. The vault entrance, square limestone, damp and new to the open air, sat tucked in the shadow of the chapel steps. By sentence 5, I'd already decided to hate the vault. We started at dusk. Lena had me sign the ledger she kept, white gloves, initials neat as printing press letters. The rain had been falling since noon, and you could smell vinegar and metal where the water bled the rust out of iron railings. Nightbirds shifted under the yews. Somewhere, a steel leaf blower in a distant yard coughed once and cut out. We relocked the front iron, flicked on the yard lamps, and started down to the limestone door. "It's like an eye," Lena said, "the way it sits here, half-lidded." Burdick cleared his throat and tapped his ring on the lock. "Don't overthink a hole in the ground," he said. "We check the braces, take the photogrammetry, we get out and have cocoa like normal people." The first anomaly was small. In the logbook at the watch house, grave 142 Miriam Peabody was listed as repaired last week. I remembered helping set the new nameplate screw on her slate marker and smoothing the damp soil with a Fiskar's trowel myself. Tonight the entry was crossed out in a different pen, rewritten for today with my initials faked. A bad imitation? I took my glove off and ran a finger under the ink. Dry, old. When I asked Burdick, he frowned through his drizzle-wet lenses and said, "There's no reason that page would have been open." The second oddity was the gate road. I'd just walked it chain in hand when a tourist couple with a tripod came to the iron and waved. I told them to come back in daylight and turn to relock the chain, but it was already relocked. The links threaded the opposite way I do it, the way our day man does it when his wrist is stiff. I don't know why that detail got to me more than the rest, but it did. I undid it and redid it my way, then told myself not to be so particular. When we got to the chapel steps, you could hear the hum for the first time. It rose through the limestone like a note trapped in a bottle. Lena paused, gum gone, and touched the stone with the back of her hand. "You feel that?" "Transformers," Burdick said. "Streetlight bleed." "Streetlights don't live under stairs," she said. We opened the door with my brass key, and for a second everything in the drizzle went quiet, like even the rain leaned in. The vault dropped 6 steps down. I let my maglite play across the interior, and the beam unspooled a dozen versions of us, small and watery, running off into mirrored planes that turned every angle into a corridor. The first thought that took shape was practical. I would need to track reflections as if they were people, or I'd lose track of the actual people. The second thought was the one you push away. The vault showed 3 of us standing at the threshold, but only 2 of us were on the steps. Burdick was still outside, shaking the water off his cap. Get in," Lena said, excitement making her voice higher than usual. "I want a full perimeter before our lenses fog." Inside, my breath coated glass. The air smelled like wet stone and old soap. The walls were backed with something dark, then faced with pieces of mirror held by rust-bitten frames. A quilt of reflections that didn't quite meet. Floor to ceiling, the ceiling was glass too, laid in squares. My boot heels went careful on the drip-slick stairs. After 3 steps, the hum under my feet rose half a pitch and set my teeth on edge. "Do you hear that?" I said. "Probably the pumps," Lena said. "There's groundwater. This was sealed until 2 weeks ago." "We don't keep pumps under the chapel," Burdick said, and tapped his ring against the inside latch without meaning to. It sounded like a clock running too fast. We started our sweep. I called out markers for the footage. Northeast plane cracked, west plane bowed, ceiling pane with silvering loss. Ordinary, if mirrors in a grave vault can be called ordinary. In the corner near the steps, a metal bell rope ran from a little square door up through the ceiling. It wasn't connected to the chapel's bell now, the line likely severed when they poured the later stairs. But the rope remained, taut and faintly damp, fraying where old hands had used it. The sight of it tightened something in my chest. You can build a life around the tools you trust. A rope like that used to mean a call for help could reach daylight. We worked until full dark. At 15% of my life with this vault, I'm guessing now it hummed again, stronger in a way that made Lena take her knit cap off for the first time. The reflections did a thing I still can't explain. Every surface showed us at different beats. In one, I was already turning my head, while in the next, I was still looking down. A tiny fraction of a second, like a dozen cameras never perfectly synced. You can explain that with slow glass, with the way moisture and old backing warp reflection, sure. You can. But it looked like stuttered memory, each surface remembering a slightly different version of us. Burdick swore softly. "I don't like tricks." Lena exhaled a cinnamon ghost and smiled, but I'd seen the way her hand stayed still. "Nothing's tricking you. Keep logging." We had names from the yard that belonged to people tied to this vault. Small plates along the baseboard carried them. Ezekiel Paris, slate sunken 2 inches out on the grass, ribbed lichen like frost across his name. Anne Brattle, rose-carved sandstone, the petals smoothed down to thumbprints. Switlow, marble eaten by acid rain until his dates were a rumor. Someone had intended a chapel vault for a few families, then turned it into an idea. Around a third of the way through the night, the lock on the limestone door clicked. I felt it more than heard it, the way a house tells you someone just came home. I spun, beam flat to the door. The Yale was hanging open, but the tongue had slid out to rest. You need a hand to do that. My hand was here. Lena's were on the plot map, steady. Burdick's were in his pockets. I stepped up, set the tongue back, and relocked. I told myself the rain had swollen something and moved the bolt. At 40% of the night, the hum rose again. My molars felt like they were singing. The reflections did their stutter, and for one beat, all of them were empty. I mean, every wall, every square of ceiling, cleared the 3 of us out and stared back with 100 black rectangles. The only shape was a smear in the lower left plane, as if someone had dragged their thumb down it. It was gone in the next blink, and we were back, all our angles marching in error. Lena's gum clamped. She held the plot map to her chest like you hold a child on a bus that lurches. No one laughed. Procedural things began to tangle. The watch house light switched off on its own. The gate road to the east looked dry under the lamp, though drizzle still hissed in the grass. The lantern in the chapel, an old visitation lamp we sometimes light for tours, wouldn't stay lit more than a minute at a time. I trimmed the wick until it was a comma, then a dot. Each time the flame made a tiny sound and sighed into smoke. On the western perimeter, a name repeated twice on 2 different stones that were supposed to be cousins. Agnes D. Mulrooney, both worn smooth around the eyes of her dates. I knew the plot map, and this pair had never lived together here. I checked the ledger. The page that had been faked with my initials was now clean, as if it knew I'd challenged it. None of these would make a strong story if told alone. Together they have the weight of a wet coat that never dries. We took a warm-up in the watch house with a thermos of coffee that steamed like breath. The sodium lights made the steaming cup look like a street trick. I logged our position, checked the Motorola to make sure dispatch could hear us. I called a radio check for fun because silence felt like the wrong conversation. Station 1 to base, check. A pause, then our dispatcher Ramos, with his habit of tapping the mic and saying each word like he was pinning it to a board. "I hear you. Keep safe." I wanted to invite his voice inside the vault with us and set it in a corner as company, but radios are fickle in old walls. I clipped mine back to my shoulder and felt the pull like a reminder to stand up straight. By midnight, drizzle soaked us down to our collars. The cemetery creates its own weather. The yews and fences hold your breath. I could name the stones that change the air just walking past them. The toddler's lamb that always smells faintly of milkweed in summer. The brick-walled family plot that warms around sunset even in March. Tonight, those same places tasted like the inside of a battery. I wrote vinegar metal in my log and drew a line to the vault steps without thinking. We went back in. The brass key turned in the lock with a feel like untying a knot in wet rope. Inside, the ceiling mirrors filmed over, then cleared in slow sheets where our warm air met cold. In the stutter of our reflections, one set of us lagged a full beat. I watched that version of me watch the bell rope. Watching myself be less brave than myself is a particular way to feel small. I don't know how to relay the next part without sounding like I'm trying to make it fancy. We were all in one place. There were no others in the cemetery. I'd locked the roads. The church was empty. Still, the mirrors, every pane from knee-height down, showed a third pair of feet standing between us. Bare. Not a distorted version of our boots. Not some parallax taking my left and right and turning them into someone else's middle. Just pale, wet feet planted with the toes slightly lifted as if the person was waiting to step. Burdick backed into the steps. His ring clicked twice quick on the latch the way you apologize to a thing for touching it. Lena didn't move. She spread her fingers like she'd been waiting years for a reason to be this still. "You're seeing it too," she said. "I'm seeing everything," I said. "Pick which thing you mean." "I mean, we don't have three." The hum climbed out of the floor like a throat clearing. The bell rope trembled. Not a yank. Not even movement you'd draw in a photograph. A twitch you could explain later as a quiver from the door we had opened, or from our own breath. My maglite beam shook in a way I didn't like. Lena set the plot map on the floor, weighting the corners with clamps from her kit. The paper looked like a set table on a bad ferry. She laid out a small mirrored square she had scavenged from a fallen shard, backed with foam. "I want to test angle," she said, more to herself than to us. "If a third is registering due to refraction, a floating mirror should capture or reject it." "Don't make friends with it," Burdick said, and then immediately looked like he regretted the words. He kept his eyes on the lower panes like he was watching a small, mean animal he didn't want to provoke. The next beat arrived as a very normal thing. The light in the watch house flicked back on and shone out the window across the yard. My eye went instinctively to it, because that's what you do when something permissible suddenly permits itself again. In the split second I looked away, the brass key slid out of my damp glove and fell to the floor. It didn't clatter. It landed soft on the plot map and made a B-flat against the mirror square. Somewhere in the angles, the third pair of feet turned and faced mine. Lena said, "Very carefully, do not step." "I wasn't planning to," I said, and didn't recognize my own voice. The hum roped itself around the bell line. The rope moved again, small as if someone on a landing below had brushed it with their sleeve. I hate it when stories pretend to present choices no one would make. I would love to tell you I didn't think about pulling that rope, but I did. The thought came because pulling a rope inside a place built to call upward felt like the only polite thing to do. My head pictured the chapel bell answering not with a crash, just with 3 slow tugs acknowledging an old agreement. I imagined sound climbing out of the mirrors like smoke. The door latch whispered. I looked up and saw my own face in 100 angles, each one with the mouth a slightly different shape. In one pane, my lips were already forming a word I do not say. In another, my jaw was set in the way I use when I lift a mower. In one, my eyes were closed like I was listening to a message. Then the radio crackled. 3 dots of static measured apart like footsteps on gravel. Ramos's voice came through tinny and plain. "North gate closed," he said. "North gate closed. North gate closed. We don't have a north gate." "I heard him," Lena said, her voice a half second behind mine. "He's at home," Burdick said. "He's not near a radio now. He parks his set at the desk at night and goes to his kids." The Motorola had a new habit, laying the words down on top of us as if Ramos's mouth were inches from my shoulder. North gate closed. The vault smelled suddenly like we'd opened a box of old bandages. The bell rope tilted. I reached for it anyway because habits are how you stay standing when your legs are shaking. I wrapped my left hand around the frayed hawsers and felt a tacky damp like the rope had wept. My right hand stayed near the maglite, thumb on the rocker. In the mirror directly in front of me, my own hand did not close entirely. A sliver of air remained where my fingers should have met. The third pair of feet took a half step back, weight in the toes. "Don't." Lena said. I'll do it, I said, and didn't know if I meant I wouldn't. The hum swelled, and with it the reflections hardened as if someone had cooled them. I counted to 3 because if a thing is coming, you might as well meet it on a round number. I gave the rope a slow tug as gently as I could, once, twice, 3 times. The rope accepted the motion. The chapel above us did not answer. The mirrors answered. Each wall took those 3 movements and played them back, not in the rope, but in the way our bodies stood, our shoulders lifted. In one pane, I saw a third shoulder respond, a shape too close to mine to be Lena or Burdick. The hum ticked down a notch as if the sound had been satisfied, the way a throat is after water. Something like relief broke in me and washed through the fear without replacing it. That is the worst kind of relief. I let my left hand fall from the rope and reached down to pick up the brass key from the plot map. The key slid away from my glove, scraped the mirror square with a bright squeak, and came to rest exactly where my palm had been in the reflection. My palm was still open. The key rattled the way the nameplate had at the beginning, twice, then once, and the lower panes showed a pair of feet stepping backward into a square of dark that wasn't there a breath before. Back out, I said. Now slow. They didn't argue. We moved like people who have waited too long to leave already. Lena gathered her map and mirror square with a neatness that would have been funny another time. Burdick's ring picked up a steady rhythm on the latch, 3 even clinks like a coded heartbeat. We climbed the steps and came into the drizzle and sodium light, and the air felt thin and loud. My radio spoke in Ramos's voice one last time. North gate closed. Then nothing but rain. We locked the door. The hum stayed under our feet, part of the steps, as if we'd stirred something that slept under mortar. I checked the chain on the iron road again. It was threaded my way. I checked the ledger for the faked entry. It was blank. I lit the chapel lantern one more time. It stayed lit, weak as a goldfish eye. The cemetery dragged its weather back over itself like a blanket. We didn't leave. Not right away. It's a superstition, or maybe just a work habit. After something hard, you do one simple job so you can say you didn't run. I walked the inside perimeter with the mag light. Lena followed, making notes on the plot map, writing names smaller now as if she were trying to keep them inside the lines. Burdick took the steel out of the shed and tried to start it, just for the noise, but it coughed once and quit again. Sensible machine that it was. On our pass near the toddler's lamb, I saw how the wet had purified its white. On the brick-walled plot, the air had found a little heat. On Miriam Peabody's slate, the new nameplate screw caught my light and shone like a polite coin flipped to the sky. At around 5, a grayness that wasn't the lights went through the trees. Dawn is the truest thief. It steals definitions before you're ready to give them up. I felt the vault under my boots even as we kept our distance, a tug the way the ocean calls your calves back. We leaned at the watchhouse counter and sipped the dregs of coffee with both hands and didn't talk much. The radio stayed dead. In the silence, I could hear that sound again, even away from the steps. The low frequency that sneaks into your blood. When the day crew rattled up the road in the city truck, Ramos was with them, yawning into his sleeve. He tapped the radio on his vest with 2 fingers, his morning habit, then smiled at me like we always meant to meet there. You all look like you watched a bad movie, he said. You were on my shoulder, I told him. He shook his head. I slept like a stone. You should try it. We made our transfers, logged the night, shrugged the rain out of our collars. Lena packed her foam-backed shard in a case like it was a fragile toy. Burdick left his ring quiet for once. I turned my mag light off and let morning be its own lamp. When I put the brass key back on its hook, it caught and wouldn't settle, like it wanted one more nudge. The metal of it felt warmer than my fingers had any right to make it. I walked to the chapel steps one last time before my shift ended. The drizzle had thinned to something like breath. The sodium lamps clicked off with a sequence that always reminds me of slow applause. I stood with my cap in my hands and listened. The city was waking beyond the fence, horns and a bus brake. A couple arguing in the way that means they aren't really angry. Under the steps, very far down where no one goes on purpose, the hum lifted once, then steadied. I reached out and laid my palm on the limestone and felt nothing but cold. I told the stone in my head that the north gate was closed. This seemed like a correct thing to tell a door. I signed out and walked toward the iron, passing Agnes D. Mulrooney twice, her 2 stones equally wet. The lantern in the chapel flickered and held. The toddler's lamb didn't care what names we said around it. At the gate, the chain lay the way I like it, links draped in a pattern I could read with my eyes closed. I looped it through and clicked the lock shut and stepped into the morning like someone stepping out of a photograph. Behind me, the watch house window caught a strip of light and threw me a soft reflection I didn't ask for. In it, for a breath, I thought I saw 3 figures moving the way you do when you're tired and happy to be done. I looked straight and it was only me, a man counting keys. The drizzle tried again. The sodium lamps quieted. Under the chapel steps, if you listened very close and understood that some parts of a place sing when no one asks them to, there was a faint, steady humming, close to the ground like a voice trying to rise. The sound I can't stop hearing is the grit under the marble, the way it chirped once and then again as if the slab cleared its throat. The bronze nameplate on the side rattled twice, slow and prim, like someone knocking from within and minding their manners. My maglite beam stuttered off the rain and struck the white face of the tomb, and for a second the letters looked wet, like the river had reached up and licked them. Something hummed under the steps of the nearest mausoleum, a vibration at the edge of hearing, like a phone on a wooden table 2 rooms away. I kept the light steady until my hand stopped shaking. I'm 34, night guard at Bonaventure Cemetery, Savannah, and I was working a double because of an uptick in vandalism and a couple of TikTok kids who kept trying to film seances. The drizzle had already ruined the cuffs of my jeans, and the sodium lamps threw that sick orange across the cedar trunks, as if every tree had a nicotine habit. We were supposed to babysit the moving tomb, because some surveyor has an ongoing bet with the river. It's a marble box from 1878 that has crept an inch or 2 every few years since someone started measuring in the 50s. Tour guides turn it into a ghost story. Dillard, who's been the day man here since before my job existed, always says the ground does what the water tells it to. Dillard smells like chicory coffee and wears a cap that says Steepats 1999, and he hates when I call him Mr. He was at the watch house when I took the keys, tapping the logbook with a pen he never clicked. Easy now, he told me. Like the night itself was a horse I would spook if I moved too fast. Erin from City Survey came with her case of reflective stakes, a compact flashlight, and that mint gum you can smell 10 feet away. She talks with her hands and keeps her hair in a bun so tight I thought I could hear it creak. We need a clean baseline, she said, because the river's up and if it's going to move, it moves on spring tides. She didn't say what happens when it reaches the bluff's edge. We made our first round at 9. The watch house heater clucked. The Motorola on my belt was quiet except for an occasional static cough. I checked the Yale lock on the east gate, working the brass key into the warded throat until it turned with a polite snap. The key is old, a heavy oval bow stamped 14 with a notch worn so smooth it's like a thumbprint pressed into metal. It's the key you'd put in a story if you wanted people to imagine the weighed-down pocket of a man and the creak of an iron gate in the rain. I kept it in my left jacket pocket because my right hand likes the maglite, and that way the weight balanced and my walk felt normal. First anomaly. The north path chain was relocked from the outside. I had opened it at sunset for a funeral family who was late, and I'd meant to take it down and stow it. Now the chain hung in the rain with a new padlock on the end, bright and dry in a place where everything else was wet. Erin made a note. Could be a neighbor. Dillard on the radio said he hadn't come by. I fiddled the chain off without breaking it, hung it over the post like a scarf. The humming under the mausoleum steps started and stopped in 4-second pulses, so faint that you question your own ears. Erin didn't comment. I didn't either. Second anomaly. The ledger page for burials in section F had a smear where a date should have been. Jolene had written it in the office. Big tidy handwriting that looks like a kindergarten teacher's, and she never smears. My thumb came away black with old ink when I checked it. Rain doesn't get into that drawer. I put the page back and wiped my hand on my pants, and when I turned the page again, the smear was narrower, as if it had drawn itself into a line. I closed the ledger and locked the drawer. Some nights you just choose to be stupid in the way that keeps you working. Third, damp footprints on the chapel steps. Not bare, not shoe tread, just an oval shape that could have been a knee printing, and then lifting as if someone had prayed with their whole body. The chapel is locked after dusk with a different key. The Yale in my pocket was for the gates and some of the old crypts. The chapel has a new cylinder and a keypad, because someone stole the candelabra 2 years back. I ran my light across the stained glass and saw my own orange-shadowed face. The drizzle had thickened to a stringy mist that the beam caught like netting. We reached the tomb just shy of 11. Erin had set her stakes earlier at measured distances from the corners, and one exactly aligned with a scribed mark on the base. She squatted and read the tape against her headlamp. "Quarter-inch east," she said. But that could be me. I leaned my palm on the marble and felt a cold that wasn't from the rain. The bronze nameplate was pitted in green, the screws I'd heard rattling older than anything I own. The inscription was for a man named L.W. Vaughn, 1839 to 1878, naval carpenter, and for his wife, Mary Ellen, 1846 to 1904. Someone had left a bright fake rose in the little niche at the end. The niche smelled a little like pennies. "Do you ever hear that?" I asked. Erin turned her head. "Hear what?" I nearly said phone, pulse, a bee trapped in wood. Instead I said, "Nothing," and swept the mag light across the ground to keep myself from listening. The drizzle ticked on the lens. At midnight, the radio spat to life with Alvarez, the city security supervisor, coming up to our gate because an alarm tripped on the perimeter fence by the maintenance shed. Alvarez keeps his leather gloves clipped to his belt like a rookie. He says, "Copy that, even when you're not sure what you said." I told him I'd meet him at the west gate. Erin wanted to stay with the stakes and watch for movement. She had her own radio. Her gum clicked when she shifted it in her cheek. "I'm good," she said. "I'm recording." I gave her the look I give my little brother when he says he's fine to carry the big ladder. She rolled her eyes and made a shooing motion. The humming under the mausoleum steps rose for a second, brief and bright, and fell back down. She didn't flinch. Maybe it was in my bones alone. The West Gate Yale lock is particular. You have to lift the weight of the bolt before the key will turn. And in the rain, the metal swells just enough to make you mutter. I had the key in my fingers when the chain slipped like it had been oiled and the gate drifted inward with no sound at all. Alvarez stood on the other side, hand on the metal, eyebrows up. "Copy that," he said, because he had to say something. He looked over my shoulder into the orange-lit dark. We did a walk past the maintenance shed, which had its own smell. A human smell of gasoline and damp cardboard and that orange soap that comes in a squirt bottle and never quite leaves your hands. Someone had opened the steel trimmer rack and then closed it again wrong. The clips were all on odd teeth like a zipper done up in a hurry. We fixed them. The shed door was locked. The fencing alarm had probably been a cat. When we circled back, Erin was at the tomb with her fingers against the marble like a doctor takes a pulse. "It's shifted another quarter-inch," she said, "or I'm less good than I think I am." She looked honest enough that I believed the tomb. "Do me a favor," she said. "Put your hand on the steps again." I did. The humming was stronger now, or it had my attention. It was under the steps of the family mausoleum 3 plots north, a small Doric thing with a bronze gate that we kept locked because teenagers like to leave aluminum cans inside and they stain the stone. The hum seemed to resonate up the columns and into my wrist, a sympathetic vibration. "Feel that?" I asked. Erin shook her head. "I feel cold." She set another stake. We do one more sweep, then we sit and watch. Fourth anomaly. A bouquet that had been on Mrs. Merriam's grave in Section D had migrated to the path, standing upright as if someone had pushed the stems into the dirt with care. The cellophane crackled in the drizzle. A note card tucked into the rubber band was blank. I put the bouquet back because you don't leave the dead undone. The hum came and went like breath. The sodium lamps buzzed. Somewhere far off, a horn sounded from the river. My skin drew tight under my jacket like I'd brushed against a 9-volt. Fifth, a repeating name. I'd walked this place long enough that names in granite are like neighbors you nod to. Mona, Daniels, Rodriguez, Crenshaw, every family, one-story, half-story rumor. But in 2 sections that night, I kept reading Vaughn. Spelled the same as on the moving tomb in places it didn't belong. A Vaughn with dates in the 1920s. A Vaughn with no dates at all, just a birth year and a dash. I told myself it's a common name and my brain was primed. I told myself many things that felt thin against the wet air. At 2, I made coffee in the watch house that tasted like rain, no matter how new the filter. Dillard had gone home at 10 with his "see you on the flip," which he thinks is very modern. The heater exhaled like an old dog. I leaned the brass key on the counter and watched it shed a little ring of moisture. The ledger drawer ticked like something cooling. The radio whispered to nobody. I wrote in the logbook that we had relocked the chain and found the footprints and that the tomb had shifted, as per Erin's measurement. The pen skipped where the paper had a faint ripple. When I went to pick up the key again, it wasn't on the counter. Keys don't walk. You misplace them. You set them on the shelf or drop them in your other pocket or knock them onto the floor. I crouched and checked, then patted each pocket, then lifted the edge of the logbook where they aren't. I checked. The heater vent, I don't know why, and the trash can because you always check the trash before you call someone. The brass key was hanging on a nail by the door, on a loop of twine that didn't exist 15 minutes before. A loop tied with a neat square knot. If Alvarez had walked in, I would have preferred he find me asleep on the chair. I took the key, without the twine, and felt the crusted cold of it press against my glove. The nail was rusty and had been there for years. The twine smelled like damp hay. I should have radioed. Instead, I put the key back in my left pocket and said out loud to an empty room, "Okay." My voice sounded sensible and small. We returned to the tomb. The drizzle had sharpened into needles and then gone back to threads. Erin's headlamp made a tunnel in the damp. "Half-inch," she said. "No wind could do that. No college prank." I didn't argue. The top of the bluff here looks out over the river. At night, the city howls are low and patient, mechanical animals breathing. You can smell the water, not the clean kind, but the iron and brackish kind that brings a taste with it like a battery on your tongue. Erin drew a quick sketch in her notebook labeled Stake A, Stake B, V, and Date Time. She put the pencil behind her ear and the gum clicked 3 times like a clock. The hum came again, richer. A sound I could have named if you'd given me 2 more seconds, and then the bronze gate of the Vaughn family mausoleum. 3 plots. North, with its small keyed lock I'd checked at 9, shook on its hinges as if someone inside threw their shoulder against it. We both turned. Erin lifted her light. "Wind," she said, and the word had the shape of a hope. The lock itself was intact. The gate rattled again. I put my palm against it and felt the vibration like a train through stone. My radio crackled, and Alvarez said something that I didn't catch because Erin said, "Listen." And the hum under the steps rose to a clear thrum, a single unwavering note like a throat singing in a room with perfect drywall. I have done this job long enough to know when you open a gate and when you don't. If a family member is inside after hours and panicking, you open it. If a kid is inside after a dare and scared, you open it. If the sound under your hand is an exact tone at a pitch that feels like it knows your teeth, you don't. But something else in me, the part that keeps the lights on when the storm kills the block, says that leaving something unattended is the worst sin. I used the brass key. The Yale turned with that precise old-world resistance, the feeling of a puzzle acknowledging it has been solved before many times. The gate gave inward and the smell of cold, dry stone pushed into the damp. I called out a name that wasn't mine. Vaughn? Because sometimes people answer to the letters carved above their heads even if that's not who they are. The hum thrummed the steps under my soles. Erin stood a little to my left, pencil behind ear, light steady. "We shouldn't go in," she said, and then, because she is who she is, added, "We should mark where our feet go." We went in. The chamber has 2 shelves and a small stone bench and a plaque that says family in a font that used to be carved when people had time. The air in there is still in a way that makes you aware of your own lungs. My light hit the bench and the bench trembled under the beam, minuscule like it was trying not to. The hum was strongest right at the foot of the steps, which is where you don't think of looking because you hurry into the room to be inside, not on the threshold. Erin crouched and put her fingers on the seam where step meets earth. "There's no seam," she said. "This should have a seam." She was right. Everything else around here is made in pieces. This felt like one poured thing. My radio cleared its throat again, and Alvarez asked for a status on the west gate because the alarm blinked a second time. I said copy and told him we were at the Vaughn mausoleum. He said copy that, I'll come up. And then the radio gave me a clean 3 seconds of silence that felt like an extra room in the night where someone stood and chose a door. The hum softened. My hand had closed around the key in my pocket hard enough that the bow pressed a mark into my fingers through the glove. "Can we shut the gate? Take measures out here?" Erin asked. "This feels wrong." I nodded and stepped back over the threshold. The first step down flexed a fraction, giving a soft sound like a wooden stair in an old house. Then it returned to stillness so fast that the part of me that tells stories told me to chalk it up to wet rubber and a nervous imagination. I closed the gate and locked it, and it felt like putting a lid on a jar where something has crawled in and calmed itself for you. When we returned to the moving tomb, it was 1 inch closer to the river than it had been at 11. Erin measured 4 times. She muttered to herself and then to me. It's migrating in pulses. It's not creep. Her light shone obliquely, on the ground where tracks would show if anyone had leveraged or pried or dragged. The mud told us nothing except that rain makes the earth forget. The bronze nameplate clicked once when I touched the edge of it. In my mouth, the taste of metal grew until I wanted to spit and didn't. My teeth felt like they belonged to someone who gritted them more often. Alvarez's flashlight appeared between the stones. He moves with his shoulders held high as if he's keeping his neck dry. Fence alarm again, he said. Nothing there. I hate those boxes. He tapped his own radio like it would confess. You two good? I told him what we had and he said, copy that because it's his ritual. His leather gloves smelled like wet dog. He asked me for the gate key to double-check the east side and held out his hand. In the drizzle with someone watching, the safe and sane thing is to hand a coworker a piece of brass. I didn't. My fingers wouldn't open. It wasn't a decision I made. I said, I'll walk you, and he didn't push it. We left Erin with her stakes. On the way to the gate, we passed 3 stones in a row with the same date for death, October 23rd, but 3 different years. The sodium light washed the numbers into blankness and then back into clarity as my beam crossed them. I told myself Savannians die when summer finally stops pretending it is autumn. The hum came from under a different set of steps now, low and steady. It was the same note everywhere, like the whole place was tuned to it. The drizzle threaded itself across my cheeks where my hood didn't reach. At the east gate, the Yale refused me. The key went in and would not turn as if the bolt were already thrown and holding. Alvarez frowned and looked up and down the fence line as if a person could sneak in during a conversation. Let me. He took the key and had the same failure. Then I realized the chain wasn't looped through the slats. The gate stood closed, but unharnessed, held by nothing but the meeting of 2 pieces of metal that should have kissed and clung. Alvarez pulled and it swung open without a sound, and when it hit the stop it rang a dull note that answered the hum at my feet. He jumped a little. Copy that, he muttered, which didn't fit, and then he laughed to himself and looked small. Back at the tomb, Erin had moved one of the stakes. I didn't touch it, she said, and her gum had gone quiet, probably swallowed. Her pencil was in her pocket instead of behind her ear. It scooted and clipped the stake, and then the stake fell. I watched it. She pointed to her phone in its waterproof case where a low-res video showed a white rectangle in orange light and an angle change of less than a finger width. Real and impossible. The bronze screws on the nameplate were looser now. I could have turned one with my glove if I'd wanted to. I didn't touch them. This is where my night forks in my memory. In one fork, I call Alvarez back, and we stand 3 men around a box and decide to do nothing until daylight, and for once the day rescues us. In the other fork, the one that happened, a surge of wind from the river lifted the drizzle into a sheet and plastered it into my face, and the hum climbed like someone pressing a key on a harmonium and refused to let go. The tomb slid another inch toward the bluff in a single brave shove and then settled. Erin said, "No, no, no," softly, the way you say it to a child who is about to learn gravity. The river horn sounded again, closer, or I imagined it closer. We had to choose. There is a thing you believe about dead weight, which is that you cannot stop it. There is also the thing you believe about duty, which is that you are supposed to try. I ran for the shed because the steel trimmer is anchored with a strap that will hold back a small car. In the night and the drizzle, the inside of the shed buzzed like a beehive from the fluorescent ballast about to die. I grabbed the strap, a coil of polypropylene, and a Fisker's digging bar because you never know. Alvarez hauled a steel wedge. Erin pulled her stakes. We anchored the strap around the base of the tomb, taking care not to cinch too high because if it toppled, we'd be on the news. I looped the strap twice around the trunk of the cedar that had been standing here since before my job existed. The bark had that cold camphor smell that reminds you the tree is also holding its breath. The strap ratchet clicked and clicked until my shoulder hurt. The hum under the steps gained a warble like a second note joining, and I knew then that the sound was not above me or below but through, the whole bluff thrumming like it remembered its soft insides. Aaron called out measurements as if numbers could make a dam. My radio sputtered and then went clear. Dillard's voice, syrup slow, asked, "Easy now?" I told him where we were because no part of me wanted him to be in it, and he said, "Leave it be. Water wants what it wants." The tomb tugged against the strap. The cedar quivered. Alvarez set his wedge against the soil in front of the base and hammered it with a dead-blow mallet. He must have been hiding in his back pocket. The wedge sank an inch and then refused more. My maglite beam cut a long rectangle through the rain. We dug a shallow trench on the riverside with the Fisker's bar and a dull shovel until the clay showed red in the beam, like a wound in the earth, except it wasn't. It was just the coast of Georgia in cross-section. The hum steadied. The tomb held for a count of 10, 20, 60. It moved again while I had my head down in the trench and my hand on the strap. The movement is small in measurement and huge in heart. A shove that told me whoever poured this thing in 1878 didn't mean for it to be a boat, but it had learned anyway. The strap sang a low note. The cedar bent. The ratchet yelped one click and my gloves squeaked where they gripped the webbing. Erin's voice hitched and came back flat with focus. "Half inch," she said. 3/4. Alvarez swore and then apologized to the air. The wedge skittered into the trench. The Yale key in my pocket had found the edge of my thigh and carved a crescent you could find later with your fingers. Holding a thing that wants the river is like holding a friend who only pretends to argue with you before getting in the car they meant to get in. It sapped something from my wrists. The hum eased back toward the pitch I could ignore. The strap stopped singing. The tomb sat a while as if catching its breath. Erin leaned her forehead against the marble and then jerked it back like she'd touched a stove. "Hot," she said, and then when I raised an eyebrow, "I swear. Not warm. Hot." I put my hand there and felt nothing but stone that remembered sun from 15 hours earlier. She shook her head and kept writing. We wrote it out like you write a fever, talking enough to prove we could. Measuring more than helped. Making promises to an object that predated our promises. At 4, the drizzle thinned and the sodium lamps buzzed louder for no reason a person could give. At 5, the hum under the steps shifted location, as if the room moved to the next plot without coming up for air. At 5:30, the orange in the air turned a shade that means the horizon is considering you again. The strap no longer held a live thing. It held a stubborn one. Dillard came back just before dawn with his thermos and his old cap and a look that said he had slept because he can. He stood with his hands in his pockets and said nothing for a full minute, just listening to the bluff like it might tell him whether we had done wrong. "You've dressed it like a mule," he said finally, nodding at the strap and poured coffee into the thermos cap. He handed it to Erin first. She cradled it in both hands and didn't drink. Alvarez rubbed his neck and said, "Copy that," to nobody at all. We left the strap. Erin took her last measurement, and it said the tomb had moved 1 inch and 3/4, more than any single night since before anyone wrote it down. She wrote the number carefully like a date on a check. I locked the mausoleum gate again and the Yale turned easily, as if eager to be of use after its mutiny at the east gate. The brass warmed in my palm, or I imagined it did because holding something you've held all night will do that. The river horn called once more in the growing light. A long, steady sound that reminded me of a child learning to hum in church and never quite stopping. We walked back toward the watch house along the path that skirts the bluff. The tide below was lacing the mud with small, bright commas where the light broke. The sky turned that flat good gray you get when the clouds are already tired. Jolene would come in at 8 and smooth the ledger page and write the date, and the office would smell like warm paper and lemon. The day tours would say that the tomb followed the tide because love is heavy, or because promises are heavier. Alvarez peeled off toward the east gate to glare at the alarm box like a dog negotiating with a toaster. Erin lingered beside the mausoleum steps and crouched as if tying a shoe. "Listen now," she said, so soft I thought she was talking to herself. The hum was gone. In its absence, every other sound was bigger. The drip from the cedar tips, the distant slap of water at the banks, the faint tick of the sodium lamp cooling as the daylight challenged it. I pressed my hand to the step and felt nothing but stone, and the way stone convinces you it has always been still. Erin stood and looked out over the river and put her pencil behind her ear, which meant that for her the night was bracketed. Back in the watch house, I placed the brass key on the counter and dried it with a square of brown paper towel that always tears on the first pull. Dillard took the logbook and added a line in his careful hand. Tomb advanced during springtide. Strapped to cedar. Remove later. He underlined remove later because he believes in doing things that could be done now, later. He tapped the pen on the paper once, twice. When I started here, he said to the window, that one was a foot farther back. Folks said it was a foot closer. They always say it was somewhere else. He put the pen down. Easy now. When I turned to hang the key on the nail by the door, the loop of twine that had appeared in the night wasn't there. The nail was clean, rusty, patient. The key sat heavy in my palm, and for a second I considered keeping it in my pocket all day. Like a talisman that had just earned the job I assumed it already had. I put it on the hook board with the copies and the tags anyway, because I like when the world looks the way I found it. We went outside to meet the day. The drizzle had decided to be fog, and the fog did the kind thing of softening edges. The strap around the tomb looked domestic in that light, like a belt cinched around a sleeping traveler to keep them from rolling off a train berth. Erin put her hand on the marble one last time and felt nothing but the cold of morning. Or if she felt more, she filed it where she files what does not help. Alvarez waved from the gate and called something I didn't catch, probably copy that, which he says for good news too. By the time the tours came, the strap had a story. By noon, Jolene had 3 voicemails from people who wanted to volunteer to sit up with the tomb on the next high water. By 2, the alarm had stopped tripping and Alvarez had forgiven the fence. I went home and slept a little, and woke with the taste of metal like a penny held between the molars and the image of the key's bow pressed into my thigh. I came back at dusk to hand off, and to see if the cedar had returned to itself. The strap was still neat. Dillard had left it in place because the tide would be up again after midnight. He had chalked a little mark on the path at his own measured point, a D with a line through it. I put my boot against it and looked out over the river and waited, just long enough to hear whether the bluff would remember me by the sound it made when it moved. It didn't. The sodium lamps blinked on with their electric wasp hum. I checked the mausoleum gate and brushed my hand across the step in passing. The stone held still under my glove. The air was ordinary cold, but somewhere in the steps, deep or far or both, the faintest line of sound trembled, a single note that could have been nothing at all. It came and went in 3 heartbeats like a breath under the floorboards. It might have been the wind, it might have been my blood, it might have been a trick of damp air, but it had the same shape as before. A quiet, steady humming under the steps, thin as a thread, there and then gone, as if the ground were practicing a song it intended to sing again.